Come on forward, please. Ms. Levin, welcome. And everybody, we don't have microphones. It is being broadcast over the internet, so you're supposed to shout like heck. So this is working out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jody Levin on behalf of the Trona industry. I'll be extremely brief. I understand the time constraints on your agenda. I want to thank the committee for its consideration of the taxation of generation sources and including solar in that conversation. That was a request that I had made at your May committee meeting, and the Trona industry does appreciate that. Since the patch was mentioned a couple of times, I do want to clarify, in no way are the Trona producers against solar or wind development. The conversation that's happening in Southwest Wyoming is how those generation sources exist with Trona mining when you subside the land. There are other multiple use practices out in the solar patch, but how that translates to a wind turbine or a solar panel is kind of an emerging topic that's going on, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, in the Trona patch. So since you are meeting in Pinedale in September, the industry would like to extend an invitation to the committee to come out, do a tour, see the Trona mines, but also see the chemical manufacturing that goes on the surface. And then you can kind of start to get an appreciation for how these different generation sources kind of exist or not exist with underground mining. So that's really all I wanted to talk about, Mr. Chairman, was just to thank you for looking at this topic. It is such a new issue that we don't even, as an industry, really have a position yet on kind of how Wyoming might look at it, other than to say solar doesn't have a megawatt hour tax on it, similar to wind, and it does not go through the industrial siting process. So when you start to look at how you balance different resources and use of the land, it's a limited opportunity to have a conversation with respect to large scale solar projects.
Okay, questions for Ms. Levin? Questions? Ms. Levin, could you briefly say what uses are precluded when solar installation goes in?
Mr. Chairman, solar is a single use generation source. So other sources, whether it's mining or wind even, there are multiple uses that can occur. Solar installations, they take out the habitat, they sterilize the land, and then you can imagine you can't recreate, you can't walk through it. And then with respect to the Trona industry, there is a concern about whether you can actually mine underneath of it when you subside the land. I should mention too, very briefly, because it ties into your conversation this morning, the other concern is the Trona patch is somewhat of a target right now. We are discovering as developers realize that there is infrastructure that is available in the Trona patch in terms of transmission lines and substations. And that, oddly enough, those exist because of the industry there. But when you are a solar developer or a wind developer and you can locate next to those facilities, it reduces your overall project cost. So those are all issues that we are exploring right now, trying to get our arms around. But it does seem to be an appropriate conversation for Wyoming in the context of what is the appropriate policy and how should the state look at this so that you don't have a situation where you allow a development to occur that then precludes future mining, because that mining is a substantial benefit to the state of Wyoming, both in terms of taxes, employees, payroll.
And Ms. Levin, just following up, do you have any idea what the benefits to Wyoming of the solar resource are?
Mr. Chairman, that is something we're working on. I can tell you it's substantially less. Exponentially might even be an appropriate word. The benefit of the Trona industry is pretty significant, Mr. Chairman. 2,300 employees, $114 million in taxes to the state of Wyoming, $356 million in payroll and benefits. So it's a substantial economic driver.
Thank you. Anybody else questions? Thank you, Ms. Levin. Who's next?
Thank you, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Keith Buron Firm here in Cheyenne, and I'm here today for West Energy Alliance and American Wind Energy Association, two renewable trades. Couple of very brief comments just on the tax discussion this morning. Wanted to start by saying that let the committee know that the wind industry wants to develop in Wyoming and has already a significant amount invested in projects that are in the pipeline. You saw some of that this morning with Dr. Godby's presentation. If the industry can realize that development, obviously it brings those tax employment benefits to the state. But the other thing we want the committee to recognize is that in order to realize these projects, it's got to be a competitive environment. And the vast majority of these projects rely on or need an off-taker or a buyer for the energy that they'll produce. And so because they need to secure a buyer, that means competition. And so in today's comparatively lower cost environment for wind, moving the tax up obviously presents a significant cost additive for the overall cost of a project, the overall cost of the energy produced. So developers want to build projects here, but if changing the tax profile puts that in a too high a range, then developers can lose out to projects in Colorado, New Mexico, Montana. I mean, you heard some of that this morning in Dr. Godby's presentation, or similar to solar projects in Arizona or Nevada. When competitive solicitations come up, they're looking for, looking at price, obviously. So if a company can't get a power purchase agreement because costs are too high to be competitive, then obviously the developer loses out on the ability to develop here, but the state also loses out on the potential benefits that those projects could bring. So the takeaway: industry wants to do business here, hopes to do business here, obviously is invested in doing that, but wants to make sure that it's done so in a competitive environment, and wants to take that into consideration as you work on these topics. So with that, I'm finished unless anyone has any questions.
And it's Mr. Buron.
Buron.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Buron? Representative Conlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bryan, you look like the right person to ask this question to. As you could probably imagine, we are getting lots of email messages about this topic. And one of them that came in late last night is from the chairman of our Minerals Committee on the House side. And he basically asked the committee to listen to arguments carefully and consider raising the tax on wind. And what I was most curious about is his third point. And in his third point, and if you will, I'll read you a portion of it. It says, in a small group meeting, I talk with or call one of these CEOs of wind companies on the table. And then he goes on to say, there is no way they have invested billions of dollars in transmission planning and permitting with the assumption that there will be no new tax increases. That would be irresponsible. The CEO admitted that an increase was in the projections. I can assure you that a tax increase is built into all companies' models and a factor in the internal rate of return. And so I'm curious if you could comment on that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, I really can't. That's not something I've heard in my discussions with either of the entities that I'm working with. So that if that's coming from somewhere else, I don't know. So I can't comment.
Mr. Chairman, just a follow-up.
Go ahead.
So I'll just ask it directly to you then. Do your companies in their projections contemplate changes in tax structures?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, again, I apologize. In terms of what individual companies do in their projections, I simply don't know. If I had an answer, I'd give it to you.
And Mr. Brown, you're representing an association or individual companies?
AWEA, American Wind Energy Association, and Interwest Energy Alliance. So both of those are trade organizations.
Then where are you from?
From right here in Cheyenne.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During the discussion this morning, New Mexico uses the gross receipts tax in relationship / possible royalty. Would you see the industry more adaptable to that type of process that would move on the ebbs and flows versus a direct production tax?
Mr.
Chairman,
your chance to start.
That's an interesting question. I listened this morning as well. Those are conversations that I have not had with the organizations I'm here for. So in terms of what they, their thoughts on it, certainly I'm going to report back to them what I heard this morning and what I've heard today, but I'm not in a position to be able to comment on what the organization's position is with respect to those.
So you earned your pay without saying too much today. Follow up, Representative Streeting.
Would you be able to have those discussions and be able to attend our last meeting? Maybe possibly a report of what your members think of that potential proposal.
Sure. I'd be happy to have those discussions with the organizations, and to the extent that they have information that they want to bring back to the committee, I'd be happy to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Anybody else? Thank you very much. Oh, Mr. Co-Chair.
I don't have a question, Mr. Chairman, but rereading the Chairman of Minerals emails, I just wanted to clear the record. I don't think he's advocating. He says it deserves serious contemplation. Just didn't want that out there in the press that he was pushing for a wind tax. Just to be fair to Chairman Greer, but he did send us an email with his thoughts that we should give it consideration and a serious look. So.
Good point, Mr. Co-Chair. I think you're okay. Thank you, Mr. Brown. Who's next, please? Who's next? Mr. Reed, welcome.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Jeremiah Reeman here on behalf of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. I do appreciate the conversation this morning around energy generation sources. Counties certainly benefit from that. There's one piece of the conversation this morning that I did want to just touch on, and that was the conversation around House Bill 120 from this last legislative session. I testified at the Corporations Committee. I just want to be fair to you all so that you understand what our issues were with that bill. But I want to start off by saying that we're not opposed to a conversation around that topic and seeing if we can come up with a compromise that meets the economic needs of communities and counties and entities of the state. Relative to that bill, you'll remember that it started out a couple of years ago specific to wind energy. This last legislative session, it expanded into a slew of energy sources, whether that be oil and gas, coal, wind, uranium, and the like. What really caused counties concern is around a lot of unknowns. Unknown about the impact relative to ad valorem that might be lost, given that there really were no strong definitions in the bill as it was passed. And just for some context around ad valorem, the counties between fiscal year 16 and 18 lost more than $85 million in ad valorem, or had a decrease in ad valorem over that time frame, which impacts a lot of local government entities. Certainly in the bill, there's a contemplation of increased sales and use tax. Again, it was unknown to many of the entities what the benefit was there, so that we could do a comparison to understand if the lost ad valorem was positive in relationship to the gain on sales and use tax. Adding to that, there was an unknown around, we know that these facilities, these storage facilities, likely are to take place in a few communities around our state, and that the sales and use tax would be collected in those communities, perhaps to the detriment of where that equipment ultimately is going to be installed. And that caused concern for a number of the counties around the state, and thus our opposition to that bill. Again, I stand here to suggest that we're willing to have the conversation similar to what the governor suggested in his veto letter, if we can work through these things, and we're ready to do that. I did want to just make one other comment relationship to the testimony that I heard earlier today about, in particular, the industrial siting impact assistance payments to communities. Certainly, there's a calculation that comes out of those situations. But the Industrial Siting Council of recent has not adopted granting those full amounts to communities. For example, Laramie County just went before the Industrial Siting Commission, was eligible to receive upwards of $7.9 million in impact assistance payments. The commission or the council only approved $5.9 million for projects. They cut that down from the request, which actually the request from Laramie County was less than the $7.9 million. They asked for $7.2 million. More recent or not too distant in the past, they cut 25% from a project that's going to happen in Converse County, which will ultimately impact Natrona County. We're seeing more and more of those reductions. So I just wanted to caution that we can't just assume that because the calculation says that this is the amount that's going to go to counties, that that's what's being granted. It's not the case under the current structure, the current membership of the council. They are reducing those payments. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd stand for any questions.
Questions for Mr. Reaman? Questions for Mr. Reaman? Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Raymond. Do you happen to know why the council is reducing those payments to, I mean, from what I understand, there's some mention from one of the members that it was at the direction of the legislature, or they were trying to, I guess, in their minds, help the state save money. But I don't know if you went to other meetings, why, if there's any other rationale for what Laramie County, my community, would have gotten 7.9 under the old formula, and we got 5. Any other justification you've heard of why industrial siting is, I shouldn't say arbitrarily cutting payments, but it sure felt like that in my community.
Mr. Reaman.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wanitzer, I'll just give a couple of answers to that. And I will say that a lot of the counties really feel that it is arbitrary, and I've shared that with a couple of members of the council. The two examples that I can give is that some of the council members are looking at requests for, say, an ambulance, for example, and looking at the lifetime of that, the need of that ambulance, and saying, well, this project only demands that we're going to pay for 2 years of that ambulance life. The rest of that really needs to fall to the county if you really want to pick up that thing. I think that's a bit unfair, and I'll just give an associated example with that. With the Laramie County project, there's a need to replace a communication system in the project area because it's going to be removed, eliminated from that project area. You can't use that same justification for something like that, but the council is. The other thing that has been conveyed to me by a member of the council is that they feel this is an unappropriated general fund pot of money, and the counties can do whatever they want through the requests, and it doesn't get oversight by you. That's inappropriate, so we're going to be the deciders of whether that should actually happen, and trying to perhaps save the counties from themselves. And I don't know that directive has ever come from you.
Anybody else? Who's that?
Mr.
Mr. Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the case of Converse County and Natrona County, my information is a little bit different in that they held back 25%. And you can reapply, those deadlines are fast approaching, for additional unintended consequences as the project moves along on the Cedar Springs project. But so it's not totally eliminated from the pot of money. And also there was a little bit of I think Commerce County expected to get it all, and where Natrona County is housing, will be housing, plus the transportation, hospital, health department issues, policing issues, all of that. So I think Natrona County did a good job of justifying at the additional hearing. So, but I don't think the money's totally out of the picture for going back and asking for that, so.
Comment briefly, please.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to get into the debate that happened between Natrona County and Converse County. There was certainly a debate on who should receive that money. But as it relates to the money that's held back, they were reduced to 25% of the request that they felt legitimately was characterized to needs that exist today. They can go back, but that's also an opportunity to go back and request impact payments above and beyond the initial calculation figure that exists in the model today. So I don't know that I would suggest that it's sort of parked money that they can just go back to. There is a process, obviously, to go back for additional resources if a need arises.
Anybody else got a question for Mr. Reaman? Anybody else? Mr. Reaman, one more. At the Corporations Committee in Casper, I believe the testimony was that the Commissioners Association would not be opposed to removing the 2-year free window at the front of the wind tax implementation. Is that correct? For the first 2 years, there's no tax collected. And I believe your member testified. I wasn't sure if that was an official county commission position or not.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, it's not a formal position of the association at this point in time, but it is something that we're interested in having as part of the conversation to understand, should the moratorium be removed? Should we have a different structure of tiering? All those things are conversations that we're having, but it's not a position that we supported at this point in time.
Thank you, Mr. Reaman. Would that be fair of any other form of structure of the tax and size of the tax? Where are you at on that stuff? Still room for discussion?
Mr. Chairman, absolutely room for discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Reaman. Who's next, please? Come on up. Ladies, please. Big Power Company Wyoming's here. Welcome. Good to see you. Welcome. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. I'm Roxanne Peruso. I'm Chief Operating Officer for Power Company of Wyoming and Trans-West Express. Those are both wholly owned affiliates of the Anschutz Corporation. And with me is Kara Choquette. She's our Director of Communications and Government Relations for the same affiliates. We appreciate the chance to address the committee. Thank you. I want to start just by a couple comments, bringing this back to the University of Wyoming study that we heard a lot about this morning. I think everybody can agree it's important to look at the entire tax framework of a state as it applies to wind and other energy. Also, second, it's really important to look at the location of that state. Is it in the Western grid? Is it a state that we as independent developers of energy are going to be competing with for our share of the market? And the third element is it's important to determine or look at how that tax framework affects the levelized cost of energy. And so with those three ideas, looking at the memo by LSO that went through the different states, LSO did a very good job of summarizing the production and capacity taxes and some of those other factors in the other states. But only out of the 10 states, there's 4 of those states that are in the Western grid, of course, Wyoming, and then also Idaho, Washington, and Montana. And if you look at the UW study that Dr. Godby walked us through this morning, the UW study looked at the levelized cost of energy in every single state in the Western grid, and that included then Idaho, Washington, and Montana. And that levelized cost of energy chart is on page 36 of the UW study. And Montana was the state that had a levelized cost of energy lower than Wyoming. Idaho and Washington, their tax policy actually resulted in a levelized cost of energy that is higher than Wyoming. But what the LSO memo didn't look at, which the University of Wyoming study did look at, is 2 states that have lower cost of energy than Wyoming. There's Montana, of course, which is the first one, but that was in the LSO memo, but also New Mexico and Colorado. So when you look at the levelized cost of energy for states in the Western grid, there are 3 states that have lower lower cost of energy than Wyoming. And New Mexico is definitely the state that we, as an independent power developer, are competing with the most for the market in the West. And New Mexico actually has the lowest cost of energy, and that's our competition. The next thing that is not addressed, and you heard this in the University of Wyoming study, is the cost of transmission. It doesn't matter how great the resource is or how much of the resource you have if you can't get it to the market. And that is one thing that we have faced as an independent developer, is having to build transmission. So to get the path for the energy to get to the market, we're having to build $3 billion of transmission infrastructure in order to get the energy to the market. That adds $20 to $25 a megawatt hour to our cost. That was not looked at in the study or in the tax comparison. And that has to be taken into account because those impact our ability to sell to the market. And the next thing I want to just touch on is power prices. When we started these projects, power prices were in the $125 a megawatt hour price range. They've now fallen to the $20 a megawatt hour price range. So the market is extremely competitive. And as you can see from the University of Wyoming study, dollars make a difference in where states fall in getting their share of the market. And so what we have asked in the many times that we have testified in front of you is for certainty. We need tax policy certainty so that we can continue with these projects and bring what amounts to, out of the $8 billion of infrastructure we're developing, $6 billion of that is an investment in Wyoming. So we are trying to bring those assets to Wyoming. I wanted to also just brief you quickly on some federal legislation, give you an update on that. So in 2017, in testimony to this committee, we recommended that Wyoming should pursue a share of federal royalties that are paid by wind and solar developing on federal lands. And in fact, in 2017, the legislature passed a joint resolution asking Congress to share those royalties equally with the state. So we committed to support that effort, and we have. And actually today, a bipartisan bill is being introduced in the House Natural Resources Committee. And there will be a committee hearing on that bill sometime in mid-July. One of the provisions of that bill is that 50% of royalties paid by wind and solar projects that are sited on federal land will come back to the state where they're located. Now, as an example, this would result in Wyoming, over $100 million of revenue just from our project alone because of the federal royalties we'll pay. So we will continue to support federal legislation, specifically this legislation, because it provides additional income to Wyoming, and it doesn't, however, result in additional risk to our project because we are paying those federal royalties already. That really is the extent of my comments. The Anschutz Corporation, we've invested heavily in Wyoming through our extensive oil and gas assets, our ranching, our recreation, hospitality, and of course our wind, transmission, and gas plant assets. Over the years, you've heard testimony from me, you've heard testimony from Kara. You know we oppose any increase in the wind tax, but I won't present any further testimony on our projects for time's sake and be happy to answer questions.
Questions for Ms. Peruso? Questions? Ms. Peruso, one for me. So you know the most important factor in terms of that levelized cost ranking is the quality of the wind. It beats the heck out of any taxes. It beats the heck out of all the other construction costs. It's the number one thing. And I think we've still got to get a handle on the quality of the wind measures used in Mr. Godby, the Professor Godby study. I just don't think that taking the best wind of a certain percentage from each state and using that as a proxy for the entire state is adequate, especially when you look at that chart that shows how great Wyoming wind really is. So I think we'll have a disagreement about that and whether we should keep going forward and where we actually do rank. But I appreciate your comments, and you've always been good to deal with. Your company is a great company, and I appreciate these opportunities. And had a chance to share the stage with Mr. Choquette at the Casper. Good exchange, and I really appreciate you being here. Thank you for what you do in Wyoming.
Thank you. As to the capacity factors that were used in the University of Wyoming study for Wyoming are 50%. And yet you also saw in the chart that the actual realized capacity of the best wind farm in Wyoming was 38%. We hope to be at about 46%, but we will still be below the 50% that University of Wyoming used in the study when they were calculating the levelized cost of energy. So if anything, we believe that the University of Wyoming study has the levelized cost of energy too low for Wyoming, which would mean other states would be more competitive. But even with the 50% capacity factor, the study shows that Colorado, Montana, and New Mexico are outdoing this. They're out-competing Wyoming for the market. And we're seeing that with New Mexico. Currently, New Mexico has wind PPAs with California entities that we do not have yet. So it is a true competition, and we don't want Wyoming to miss out on it, and we've certainly put a lot of years and invested a lot of time and money to try to make the projects a reality.
Thank you. That was an excellent answer. I think you're probably the only company competing in the Southern California market. I don't know that, I think most of the new wind development in Wyoming is looking at the Northwest, and that's certainly, I think that has a factor as well. But good luck.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Conlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I'm curious if you could comment on the presentation this morning from Drs. Gabi and Cook regarding for us to contemplate switching the taxation structure that we have for renewables. That notion of dollar amount per megawatt hour is in fact something that will dissuade companies from further development because of the volatility of actually the cost of energy. And so to actually, now I understand about certainty, that you want certainty, but that, I guess I'll just ask you for your comment on a switching of the way that we think about taxation.
I understand where Dr. Godby is coming from in indicating that, let's say back in 2010, when the wind tax was passed, that would have been a good consideration. You know, is there a different way where we could impose a tax that would in effect rise and fall with the market prices? So in that respect, that has some attraction. Of course, how that actually plays out, again, would go to the entire tax framework. Is there still, for instance, going to be a property tax? Is there still going to be a sales tax? What is the percentage of this gross receipts tax? So all of that would have to be taken into consideration. On top of that, right now, I will go back to the idea of certainty. We have come so far and so long in these projects that right now it is more important for us to have certainty than to get into another discussion of how we change things. If Wyoming really wanted to look at being more competitive, I think the more straightforward way would be to do what other states have done and look at exemptions or other ways to make the state more competitive. But let me be clear, we're not asking for that. We are just asking for certainty. Let us go forward with the existing tax structure so that we can try to make these projects reality.
Anybody else? Thank you both very much. Who else like to testify? Yes, sir. We're definitely running short on time, so let's try to hone it down. Put people on timer real quick.
Appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Chairman. I'm Sean McCarville with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. I have with me Business Manager Jerry Payne. local IBEW local 322. So that I'm not redundant, I would just like to speak from a worker perspective with, as the IBEW throughout the country talks about a diverse energy structure, we need all structures as that. So let's maintain our fossil fuel plants, but when wind opportunities come up, let's have them here in Wyoming for the workers, men and women in Wyoming performing that work. And specifically with large scale projects such as are being proposed and transmission lines presently being built by Pacific Corp, these are the opportunities we need to train that next generation of worker. Only so much comes from the community college format, but actual hands-on work on these projects within the state in which the workers come from are important, and I believe should be part of the committee's considerations. So I'd just like to go on record that way.
Thank you. Would you like to add anything?
He knocked it out of the park. I could just say we represent around 600 men in the state of Wyoming, 800 if you count Cheyenne's local. We're on the Gateway project right now, building the 500 line. We're going to peak in about 225 guys. We're getting people from the communities involved in those projects, and we're committed to those communities. We want to train the next generation of worker and have them stay here in Wyoming. So.
And would you say your name again?
Jerry Payne.
Questions for these gentlemen? You all don't know Rocky Henderson, do you?
Absolutely.
We can still talk.
Yes.
He's a great friend. He's a good man. Thank you. All right. Thank you both.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else on this topic? Should we move on? Looking to move on? Mr. McVeigh, bring up the team. We're now going to talk, we just finished lunch.
He is the team.
And so it's implications for Wyoming from changing energy markets.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. McVeigh.
co-chairman, members of this committee, Buck McVeigh, now acting chief of staff for Governor Morgan. Pleasure to be here today. Just going back to the May meeting, this committee had a worthy discussion regarding the tax studies, efficiencies in revenue collections and modeling capabilities. I was given the opportunity at that meeting to come up and address the effort that we in the governor's office were looking into at Governor Gordon's request. And that effort was really to assemble a broad-based body of experts. And we're specifically looking at the entities of the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources, the Center for Business and Economic Analysis at the University of Wyoming, our state's Economic Analysis Division, the Legislative Service Office, and the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority, and our Public Service Commission. And these were people that we felt were going to be most well-versed in state tax and revenue policy, and as well as state, national, and global energy policy, to study the implications of these dramatic changes that we're seeing in the energy market that are affecting our state and local communities. Changes that are seemingly escalating by the day, as we've seen in the last week, the dramatic change in Powder River Basin. So this study would ultimately report impacts related to a changing energy market at these levels, at a regional, statewide, and local level. And Chairman Case and I, for years, I know we've talked about revenue modeling and wide pass capacities and what that could actually do in helping policymakers and educating the public on the ramifications of changes in our industry. So our group, this group, had its initial meeting on June 19th to discuss and plan on how best to move forward on this endeavor. And I have to say, the level of enthusiasm within this group was absolutely phenomenal. And Chairman Case sat in on that meeting. We also had Public Service Commission Chairman Kara Fornstrom. We had the UW Assistant Dean of College of Business, Steve Farkas. We had, I think, collectively 5 PhD economists in this group, as well as Jason Bager from the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority, John Richards from the Legislative Service Office, and that was, and then from the governor's office, I was in attendance. Policy advisors Rob Krieger and Rennie McVeigh were also there. But now that was just the initial effort to bring these folks together. It's since now been expanded to include Dr. Wenlin from the Economic Analysis Division and Department of Revenue Director Dan Noble. So just some of the things that we discussed in this meeting that, and I want to say for the benefit of this group, this is nothing that as you know has been mandated. This is nothing that's by rule. This is just something that we're interested in putting together. I think it's a long overdue effort, and I think that it's going to benefit the state very well. The group discussed Wyoming's revenue streams, which we all know are largely dependent on tax collections from the extractive industry, most specifically those related to energy production. This resistance that we have in the state to new taxes or raising taxes, and this concept that's been out there for many years, the Tax Foundation's label that they've given us as being #1 business friendly, as well as the tax chart that was produced by the Economic Analysis Division that showed the total personal tax collections for a 3-person family versus what that family would utilize in public service costs. All of these things that demonstrate that it's probably time that we look at the way we do business in this state. So that's kind of the genesis of this group. As we all know, the landscape for energy production has changed dramatically since 2015 and continues to change. Funding inadequacy is going to continue. This really is not a blip on the radar screen. We've had blips before, and we've always managed to recover by means of the infamous rabbit in the hat thing. And we're just not, as a group, we're just not out there, we're not finding any rabbits in the hat that are actually coming into play at this point.
We're not even finding any rabbit droppings.
This is true, yeah. So we wanted to look at our revenue streams using other states' tax systems, recognizing, however, that other states do not have the constitution that we have. So we need to take into account modeling with Wyoming's unique restrictions. The main emphasis, as I said earlier, of this group is the need to provide education. And this is education to inform you folks as policymakers, our other elected officials, and the electorate, because we all know the resistance that we face in this state to finding any additional revenue sources. So I think it's wise that we just basically educate people about the problem that's at hand with coal plant closures, the loss of coal production that is underway and it's only going to worsen, and how we're going to move forward with our state. And it needs to resonate on Main Street. We've long counted on your committee, Mr. Chairman, to address the issues of revenue. and how we're going to move the state forward. You've run into roadblock after roadblock in doing so, and it's a tough job you folks have. So we want to be out there to try to produce some sound data and not make any predictions or any outcomes at all. We want to just provide you with the data, the predictions, and let you move forward with those. So, and in that, we want to identify opportunities. We don't want to limit our scope to just to coal alone. We want to look at all fossil fuels, and we want to look at renewables as well, and be able to forecast what effects these changes that we're seeing, either the addition of wind energy coming on, the demise, if you will, of coal and other fossil fuels. Incidentally, I heard a statistic there that natural gas today is probably where coal was 20 to 25 years ago. So the pressures on fossil fuel and CO2 production are only going to continue to escalate. So in closing, I just want to say that we're identifying the ways that the state-owned REMI model that's housed in the Economic Analysis Division can be used in this endeavor. Additionally, the university has input-output models over there that use an entirely different set of multipliers from REMI. They're a static based modeling system as opposed to the REMI that has a dynamic capability. So we want to look into really heavily utilizing these models and deriving scenarios. So lastly, I'll say that we left that meeting. We divided. We looked into 3 subcommittees. One that develops scenarios with potential outcomes. This group right now has been, and this is comprised primarily of the economists. They're coming up with some incredible information at this point, and the dialogue among themselves is very, very encouraging. The second one is going to be the group doing the modeling. It's either going to be one entity using REMI, or it's going to be a combination of entities, comparing the outputs and the outcomes of these particular models for accuracy, and then one that will communicate the entire program. All of these data come out, but how do we really tell the story that that needs to be told? And we'll coordinate between the revenue, this committee and Dow and the university programs as well. So that's pretty much it. We're looking into scheduling of more meetings coming up, but again, this is just a group of working individuals that share the same concerns about where the state's heading in the future. So.
Okay. I might add, Mr. Coachella was invited but couldn't make that meeting.
Yeah, but it was, Mr. Chairman, I thought a phenomenal meeting, though. I thought it was very productive.
Quick question, Mr. McVeigh. So I heard a lot, and just correct me if I'm wrong, we're modeling, we're collecting data, we're looking at scenarios, but that next step of proposing initiatives, solutions, path forward, is that contemplated, or we're just really at painting the picture at this point, and then once we get that information to the public? What I heard from testimony, we're going to do this, you're going to turn it over to the legislature and have us try to come up with a solution, which we have failed to do so for a while now. Is there any thought that we're working jointly on a solution that everyone can get behind, or is that we too soon for that?
Mr. Chairman, very good question, Co-Chairman Wanzer. The whole endeavor was kind of predicated on not just one single group working on the data. It would be a collective effort. It would involve people from the governor's office, the executive branch, LSO, infrastructure authority. We get the University of Wyoming involved, so that we're taking an all sides, all views aspect. And this isn't, and I want to make this clear, this isn't a push for any one tax, or for that matter, any taxes. What we want to demonstrate is if we were to model our current situation, model our current energy situation that we know as it stands, status quo, and model it using, let's say, other states' examples of tax policy, tax structures, just to show what the potential is for our state, and the fact that, more importantly, what our revenues are going to do under the current plan moving forward. So that's kind of where we.
Anybody else? Representative Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, Mr. McVeigh, congratulations on your appointment.
Thank you.
Do we have a timeline? Do we have a goal? Are we talking about 6 months, 2 years, 4 years? What are we talking?
Mr. Chairman, that's a very good question, Representative Blackburn. As the governor stated when he was addressing the Endow group, we obviously cannot wait 20 years for something like this. We can't wait 10 years. And I don't think we can wait 5 years. This has to be an endeavor that's going to come together probably within this year, I would say, to have some ideas, some scenarios thrown out there. This isn't going to be a process that's going to be solved in any short-term deal by any means. It's going to take a deliberate and a very calculated set of minds here, and it's going to take some heavy discussion on how we're going to move this state forward. You folks know better than any of us how tough it is to get any initiatives passed. So it really needs, we really need to educate the constituency, and it needs to start there, I think, on Main Street.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So
Gotta speak up, because
am I guessing that we're going to have something by September, our next meeting?
Mr. McVeigh.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Blackburn, we will definitely have at least one more meeting, possibly two, before that time. So we'll be able to come back before this body and report on the progress of our endeavor.
Anybody else? So just by way of, I'm sorry, Representative Roscoe, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I looked, you just weren't very flamboyant with that.
He's not fast.
Go ahead.
Can we expect at some point, I appreciate what you said about educating the public. It's who they're going to elect. It's involving ideas that are going to come forth to us all. Are we going to expect anything in the media about that, about our history, what we have cut already, and what the projections are? Because I don't think the population, the Wyoming population, understands all that.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
Representative Roscoe, we're exactly right. And honestly, we haven't discussed the communication, but it would ultimately have to be, I'm sure it would be covered by media. But and again, I just want to emphasize it's
the wind people.
Yeah. We will report the data, and it's for
Okay.
others to to decide. So anyway.
So just kind of way of the big picture about this, I thought the first meeting went well and went off in the kind of the right direction. First off, it was before we learned about Joule, but a big focus of the first meeting was discussing how will coal ratchet down? And how do we model that with our income streams? We know that coal, how much coal will be there in 10 years, how fast will it ratchet down? We spend a lot of time, and I would say most of the people were saying it's going to be faster than slower. And, and then the decision was made to really focus on trying to model the different aspects of coal. And it's just so strange that within a week, the Joule bankruptcy is on the table. But anyway, that was the real focus. And Dr. Lewis here and some other people that were talking about that. Just to put that in perspective, I've been in the legislature the longest of anybody at this table. When I was in the legislature, we talked about coal having at least a 200-year economic life, that it was going to be a giant driver in Wyoming's future, that we'd be the energy capital and on and on and on. Well, look how that has changed up. And we discussed this in Lander a little bit. That's really off the table. It doesn't matter whether you're a global warming believer or not. The realism is that the world is changing, and that is changing. Now the question is how fast. And then I look, well, what if the same policies that have brought us to this point in coal affect other carbon-related minerals? I think everybody talks about, gas. I hear a lot about that, but petroleum is really significantly on the table. And just thinking, we talked about what if in 10 years, half the new cars are electric vehicles? And they have to charge at night, by the way, when solar's not working. But just all these things. So that's kind of my hope for the next step, is to start modeling really what does happen. We're seeing a boom in oil production, a rush to leasing because of worries about federal policy. But what if in 10 years we are in the same position with oil that we are with coal right now? And I don't think that's unrealistic. Natural gas, I have some hope for, because the truth is we can't do 100% renewables in the electric utility grid, and natural gas will be there. And I also see it as a bridge for diesel vehicles. But honestly, and we were all talking about this, and there's several of these experts here, which I'd like to just hear from them all. And Dr. Liu is here, and he wasn't there. There's been a lot of email traffic about what's going on. So I wonder if he could join you at the table, and anybody else from that committee. Dr. Cook, I'd be happy to have you. And Dan, you're on the list. Why don't you guys just come up? Make it easier. Is Dr. Godby here? Yes, they're both there. Who else have we left off? If you could bring your own chair. Dan, you think you're going to get away with this? Anyway. So, and I don't mean to try to steal any of the thunder of what this group's doing, but these are big things to think about. And I really admire the governor for putting this together. And it didn't require a task force from the legislature. It didn't require any mandates. And it's just beginning to happen because it has to happen. It finally really does have to happen. So, Buck, you could point to whoever you want, but I know we had Dr. Liu on the agenda, so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will defer to Dr. Liu to start off. And as we have Dr. Godby and Dr. Cook here with us that spoke earlier today.
Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and member of the committee. My name is Wenlin Liu. I'm the administrator of the Economic Analysis Division with the Administration and Information Department. And I have been with the office for many years. Actually, I did work with Buck for many years. I was the administrator of the division. So talking about the model, and our division has been using REMI model for probably more than 20 years. And before 2011, we always had the statewide model, and 160 sectors. What I mean by 160 sectors, that's more detailed economic sectors. And then in 2011, through legislations, we add 23 regions, we add 23 counties model, 160 sector, 23 county model. And then during budget reduction, we cut that back to also 23 counties regional model, but we cut back to 170 sector from 160 sector. And then 2 years ago, I think about end of 2017, through Yingdao program, they were interested. We also have REMI economists here. We added another function of the REMI model. Not only can estimate the impact of economic impact, such as employment, GDP, personal income, or that impact. This tax PI model is the added function. It also can estimate the impact of revenue and expenditure. So that's a newer function. But we didn't have the budget, so started 2 years ago. That additional function, that part of budget was paid by Yingdao program through Gov's office. So now we're trying to put that into our, instead of we pay some, they pay some, we're trying to put that into exceptional 21-22 standard budget. It is an expensive model. Some of them are already like a UW using in-plan model. It's different model. Of course, you have different assumption. Of course, the result is going to come out somewhat different. That's understandable, as long as we can understand. And actually, past a few weeks, I have been working with the UW Business College and Legislative Service Office and some communication through Senator Case, and we've been talking about. We're trying to understand the model difference, and we're trying to understand what's a reasonable way to insert input into the model, and we will try to understand the output, how reasonable these outputs, and we have been discussing that.
So we have begun. You've already kind of begun a little bit.
Yeah, we had some experiment, and for example, you assume, what percent coal production decline from 2018. It's, this year decline 10%, maybe in 2 years decline 15%, in 5 years decline 20% from 2018 level. And what's the result? The other thing is the impact is going to be big. We all understand, because that's coal mining. It's different from you close the Kmart and you have 200 employees lost. This 200 employee from coal mining is completely different from 200 employee from Kmart. And number one, their wage rate is so high, their average wage probably 85,000. That's double as much as Wyoming average. And the other thing is we are not talking about the revenue impact. That's even not comparable. Because the mining company pays mineral severance tax, FMRs, federal mineral royalties, and property tax based on production, and also their industrial property. Also their workers, because their wage is higher, of course their spending is higher, they contribute to sales use tax. And their wage is higher, probably their house is going to be higher, and they contribute more property tax, residential property tax. So the impact is going to be higher, definitely.
Very good. So, Dr. Liu, I remember from the meetings that we talked about reductions in coal of 10% and 15% a week. I think the consensus was that's not enough, and it's going to be faster and it's going to be bigger. And I don't know, based on the events this week, that could be very true. Let's open it up to everybody else. And Kimberly, jump in if you got a question for Dr. Liu, or should we hear what the others have to say?
No.
Okay. Hey, gurus from the over the hill, doctors.
So you collect a bunch of economists when you want to hear dismal news.
Yes. It helps us share the blow for each of us.
Right. So to your comment about coal declines, there are a couple issues there that we'll need to think about with respect to regional and statewide impacts. So the first, to your point about coal declines, we are looking at well, a scenario that I suggested was that the baseline be by about 2025, at least a 25% decline from where we are today. There are some scenarios that are much worse than that. There's a possibility that we could consider a scenario that is better than that, say a 10% decline, but that would only be reasonable if we had significant declines in other fuels, for example, gas. So that is not, by no means is that a rosy scenario. It just passes the pain somewhere else. The second issue regionally, and Dr. Liu talked about this, is the real difference between the regions of the state and the production that they have. So while our western area only produces about 4% of the coal, it employs about 20% of our coal miners. And in addition to that, closures in the west will also probably be associated with, at least we're talking about them now through the Pacific Core IRP process, plant closures as well. And so there are some preliminary estimates that were done before our meeting that way, but we do need to be very careful about how we look at declines in coal across the state. The Powder River Basin is primarily being driven by closures elsewhere. And hopefully the case is that as those declines continue, the plants in eastern Wyoming are more likely to be the last ones standing, so to speak, because they have such a cheap coal source. But in western Wyoming, we may not be able to have that. So those are some of the details additionally that we need to consider. And to your point, I'm now thinking about potential oil and gas scenarios, and some of the initial, let's say, consideration is coming from sources like the Energy Outlook that the EIA produces, which is a comprehensive model of the United States energy system that considers not only how our energy production changes, but also how those change around it and how those then feed back. But then they would be inputs to the REMI model as well as to models that we use at the university. We have our own, as Dr. Liu mentioned, and we're not trying to claim it's any better or worse, just an additional model to inform us, looking at both impacts and revenue. A few years ago, we produced a coal impact study that included oil and gas impacts for the impact that we thought might occur with the Clean Power Plan. But the reality is today, without the Clean Power Plan ever being implemented, the market is as bad or worse than we expected at this time in the worst possible case of the Clean Power Plan. So to your point, things are moving pretty quickly.
Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thanks, Dr. Godby. Was the, I guess I can say Black Jewel mining, is that part of, have we done any modeling in the last week since that? Before then, certainly it was, a decline. We just took a massive dip, I would think. I don't know if you know the percentage of what output that was in the economic drivers, but no, that's gone and not coming back. Do we have to shift the whole model, or how does that play out, I guess?
Before you jump in, Doctor, I think that's going to be a pretty complicated question, because when the jewel mines have power customers, and those customers still need coal, and they still need coal for the first seed need of the plants, they're tuned in to burn Powder River coal. Whether someone will come in and operate the jewel assets to provide that coal, or whether they'll get it from somebody else. My guess is it's going to be less. My guess also would be done with a lot less people, but that's my thinking. To you, Doctor.
Thanks. So the problem with this sort of modeling is it's long-term, and it's going to miss the fact that this isn't probably going to be a smooth glide path. What we experienced last week is probably not abnormal in the sense that we will kind of stair step, just as a few years ago we had nearly 500 people laid off on the same day. That's the nature of this. So the study I think we're looking at, and Dr. Liu can talk more about the specifics of some initial ideas around Black Jewel, but I'd say this about the modeling framework. we can't possibly predict exactly what's going to happen, but we can give people an idea of what the potential range is and what the magnitude of that potential range might be. So if it's 50 billion, it's not 500 million. Now, additionally, it would be more useful, and I think this is where multiple models are useful, is that we can say the range may be within this bound or this bound. And we can also do that by varying the inputs or the assumptions into the models, for example, that we're using. So using the REMI model, you could look, for example, at Black Jewel with, or an event like that, to get an idea of what maybe the high and low bounds are for an outcome. And that's really, I think, what we're trying to do. We're at initial phases of what we can do. And we had a short conversation this morning regarding the potential to at least coordinate some of our assumptions with other states. And so it's possible that there's been some informal contact between Montana and Wyoming to see if it's possible that the modeling groups might actually talk a little bit about possibly a common scenario, so that as the states consider this, they might consider something that's comparable across states.
Anybody else? Mr. Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just something I've kind of been thinking over the last week since the news came out.
So we don't have microphones, so we got to kind of shout.
Sorry about that, Mr. Chairman. A question I've kind of been thinking or wondering in the last week or so since the news came out, maybe you guys can help shed some light. So I looked up and they had about 30 to 35 million tons worth of coal under contract that they had to produce. Gates were closed, locked, all that stuff. My question is, wouldn't this theoretically almost be kind of beneficial to the other surrounding mines, because don't those contracts have to be filled? I don't know if that's exactly within kind of you're not a contract fulfillment experts, but just, from your perspective as economists, would that potentially be beneficial for the surrounding mines, possibly?
Dr. Godby, Dr. Cook?
I personally am not.
Dr. Wu?
The contracts that they have in place at those specific sites. I know that power plants try to keep a stockpile in reserve. So if there is some sort of interruption in supply, they can still operate while those issues are being worked out. I have a feeling that's what they're going through right now, is iterating through those procedures and figuring out if they do in fact have to find an alternative supplier to power those plants. That's about all I can say about it.
So it also could be that a power plant that's sort of on the block is stuck in a coal contract might view this as a favorable opportunity to speed some things along, which is not good for us, or maybe, but it's possible. Each contract would be different.
To answer your question a little bit differently, the problem in the Powder River Basin right now, and it's not just the Black Jewel news from last week. 2 weeks ago, we had a major announcement that the two largest and probably healthiest companies are looking at combining all of their mines to create one joint venture. A month and a half before that, we heard about Cloud Peak declaring bankruptcy. The problem really there is that we have a capacity up there that can produce in excess of 400 million tons and a market demand that's under 300 million tons. And we've seen no adjustment. And you can only have that imbalance for so long before we eventually see which companies have to potentially drop out or change, somehow consolidate. So the process that we're seeing, while it seems like it's sudden, this is the natural process that it will occur. If we continue to see this structural decline, we're going to have to continue to see reduced capacity in the basin. And that means, if this were to happen efficiently, you would expect that the higher cost mines would drop out. You'd be left with the low cost mines. How this actually works out in reality, though, is a lot messier, and it depends on company finances and their ability to continue. To your immediate question, could this potentially create a little bit of a boom? If that capacity adjustment occurs, it will at least create potentially a little bit more stability in the basin, in the sense that right now when you have too many mines and not enough demand, you end up in a situation where you potentially have cutthroat competition, or all of the mines are working at a capacity that is not as efficient as they could be. And so if you get, as you see some of the mines drop out, then the question becomes who's left and can they operate more efficiently? So we could have the outcome of this in the longer term could be a more profitable sector that is maybe less prone to these changes, but it's still very difficult to understand how it might adjust.
Dr. Liu.
Mr. Chairman, in terms of the modeling, it's forecast is as good as assumptions. We always say that. So we can, as far as that, we can put different scenarios, different assumptions. Maybe 5% of that black sugar production is about. If they produce 32 million or 31 million or 33 million, that's about 10% of 11% of Wyoming's total coal production. So you can make that assumption. So it's 5% will be replaced by other mines, or 10% or 0%. We can do different assumptions and we can regard all the impact. But one thing is that, again, the REMI model is right now is based on 2016 was the base year. That means before 2016 was the actual historical data. They started 2016 is the forecast. We'll pretty soon get the 2017 base model. So what I mean is that you can always make assumptions. The other thing is that the black drill down right now. The model is again based on 2016. Back then, our economy is a lot worse than today. Our unemployment rate was high. Today, fortunately, our unemployment rate, Wyoming is seasonally adjusted unemployment rate is 3.5%. That's very low. That's 1% lower than the US average. Actually, that's the lowest in over 10 years. Last time we were that low was back to 2008. So it's not because our Wyoming's economy is booming, just because Wyoming has a large proportion of baby boomers, including me. So many of us crossing 65 years old. So we have a big gap between baby boomers and Generation X. And this gap is as many as 15,000 people. So we just do not have enough workers, baby Generation X to replace baby boomers. So what happens? Since 2015, our labor force continued going down and finally getting stable, but still kind of going down. That just means many people retiring from the labor force. Also, of course, many young people continue probably, not as many as before, but probably continue moving out of the state. So all that said is what I mean is that for these workers laid off, they have a lot better opportunity to stay in the state if they don't have to move because unemployment rate is low. Of course, you have to. If you have to get trained, change your occupation. If you want willing to change from coal mine to oil and gas construction, or oil and gas drilling, or even as much as to wind power projects, or of course, I think the state needs lots of nurses. That's different. For a 35 years old big guy to turn into a nurse, you need lots of training and lots of mental, even occupation change. If you have to, if you think you can, that's opportunity.
Takes time. Hey, Dan, we haven't heard from you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. Dan Noble, Director of Department of Revenue. I think my piece in this discussion will be to, once we figure out what that gap is going to look like, what that revenue gap is going to look like, do one of two things: either figure out how we fill it with either a broadening of taxes that we currently assess, or looking for opportunities for economizing on how much we spend. You are in the process of going through an efficiency study right now, which I hope will provide you some opportunities there. But there's going to be some hard decisions to be made, obviously, and one of them is, and you've heard of this in the last few meetings you've held, is that we have a structural problem as it relates to our taxes. We spend on a per capita basis an awful lot more than our citizens pay in taxes, and that creates a huge problem. The mineral industry has provided that buffer for I don't know how many years now. They're not necessarily going to be as big a player in the future going forward, and that's the hard reality of what we're looking at, is that there will be a change one way or the other. Either we decide to do more with less, or we find a way to replace that income. At some point, if we just keep spending the savings, there won't be any, and we'll be faced with that decision at that point. But I guess that's really the hard reality of the situation, is that we are losing a portion, if you will, not all of it, but a portion of the mineral wealth that has paid the bills for so long. And we've got to find a way to either replace it or economize on what we do as a state. And I think that's going to be part of my job in this piece of it, is to, as a matter of fact, I've looked at a couple of states, and I want to present them today, this afternoon, and show you that you don't necessarily have to have new taxes. You can actually deal with the taxes that you have to deal with some of this. Not necessarily all of it, but a portion of it. So.
Any questions from the committee for this panel? We have public comment built into the agenda right now, and I thought it might be useful if you guys wouldn't mind just staying there, and we could allow public comment to go, and maybe you would be reacting to the public comment more than we would. So who would like to provide public comment on this topic? Anybody? Yes, ma'am. And I bet we could find you a chair. I bet we could. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you, sir?
Great. Do you want a chair? Or do you?
Thank you.
Oh, see, they're gentlemen after all.
Thank you, Ken. Or
They just want a hot seat.
Yeah.
Rob, why don't you grab that folding chair back there? I'm not letting you get away. Yes, please. Your name, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, committee. My name is Lindsay Hanlon. I'm a constituent of Cheyenne. I'm here to represent myself and to support any legislation that decreases Wyoming's dependence on taxes from the mineral extraction industry. I'm a fifth-generation Wyomingite, and for 3 generations, my family has had a ranch, partially in Wyoming, partially in Colorado, in between kind of Encampment and Walden for those who are geography junkies. And that ranch is adjacent to public lands. So protecting those public lands means protecting my home, protecting my family legacy, and it means making sure that a 6th generation of my family will have an open, green place with clean water, abundant wildlife, and healthy crops and animals. An over-reliance on mineral taxes has actually already begun to harm these public lands and to harm my home. Almost all of our forests and the nearby public forests were burned down by the Ryan fire, a fire that was made worse by years of climate change, which left the forest parched and riddled with beetle kill. I really fear for the day that the nearby public lands are leased to increasingly desperate mineral companies as they search for a new source of income, and our ranch becomes just an inconvenient roadblock on the road to mineral profits. I ask that you look into alternative tax sources like the National Retail Fairness Act that spread the burden of supporting our state and decrease the continued invasion and destruction of our lands by mineral companies. I ask that you take the steps necessary to ensure that there are still public lands for the future generations to enjoy. Thank you all very much for your time.
It's Mrs. Graham, right?
Hanlon.
Hanlon, I'm sorry.
No worries.
No, questions for Ms. Hanlon? Questions? How do you feel about wind?
I'm very into wind. My family actually used to own a wind and solar company. We were doing installations and we found out that on the small scale, at least about 10 years ago, nothing in the world could keep up with Wyoming wind. We basically went broke because we were fixing our windmills all the time because Wyoming is just that good at making wind. So
maybe you could lease your land to one of these big companies.
I honestly would be open to pretty much any option that would make sure that our family lands would maintain our independence, but also help our entire state find revenue that is going to actually get us into the future.
Thank you. Thank you. Questions? Senator Brightman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, I didn't catch you. How much money would you be willing to spend extra in taxes? You said
Ms. Hammond.
you're willing to spend more.
Thank you, Chairman. I would be willing to spend a much greater proportion of my income on taxes. I'm cognizant of the fact that what I pay in taxes is a fraction of what I get back from the state in terms of what the state provides. I would be perfectly honestly fine with giving half of my income to taxes if it meant that the people around me were healthy and happy and that we had a safe economy and a good environment.
Okay. Anybody else? Thank you, Ms. Hammond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Who else would like to address the committee? Who else on this topic? Yeah, come on up. Did I say something wrong?
No, she hasn't today.
Oh,
Yeah.
committee rules are different. We might need more chairs, or maybe they won't. Hi, welcome. If you don't mind sitting with that bunch of guys,
Sounds
they're the
good.
gurus.
Used to it. I have 4 boys, so
All right,
in good company.
welcome. What's your name, man?
Marcy Kindred.
Kindred. Welcome. Go ahead.
Thank you. All right, well, I moved to Cheyenne, Wyoming 11 years ago this summer from sunny southern Utah. I'm from a place where the temperature rarely falls below 40 degrees, and every 3 years or so, a freak snowfall of less than 2 inches shuts the entire town down. When I moved here in 2008, my oldest in the back there was not even a year old, and I didn't own a pair of closed-toed shoes, let alone a winter coat. I remember the first time I saw a Wyoming blizzard, I called my mom panicked. Mom, it's snowing! And the snow is falling sideways. It's like a snow globe. That first winter was rough. I'd say the first 5 winters were rough. I think it goes without saying that I didn't stay in Wyoming for the weather. Wyoming grows on ya, and in true Wyoming fashion, it grows on ya in its own time, slow and steady. I stayed because as each of my 4 boys reached school age, I realized I lived in the state with some of the best schools in the nation. I stayed because of the people. They're resilient, and they take care of each other. They have to survive those Wyoming winters. I stayed because these perfect Wyoming summers are worth every sideways snow-blowing winter storm. And I stayed because you can't beat the sunset on these prairies. I don't have to drive too far to lay on the hood of my car to see the stars, or hike, or camp, or fish. I stayed because it's the perfect place to raise 4 active boys. In my home, the question, what do you want to be when you grow up, elicits a gamut of responses from butcher to movie star, from football player to bus driver. I'd like to imagine them pursuing their interests here in this great state. I would like our family to call Wyoming home for generations to come. You know what happens when Wyoming kids graduate? A lot of them leave. And if we don't diversify our economy, it's not going to get any better. I and every Wyomingite has benefited from mineral taxes. I am so grateful to everything that it has provided me and my family. But we have to wake up and see that the world doesn't want what we're selling anymore. If the mine closing in Gillette, devastating hundreds of Wyoming families like mine, if that does not stand as an egregious warning, I don't know what will. And we can't do this on Wyoming time. This is not something to be accomplished at our usual slow and steady pace. This needs to be done yesterday. Action must be taken now. And we cannot sacrifice a huge part of what makes Wyoming amazing, our beautiful lands and wildlife, to squeeze that last remaining cent out of a dying industry. Wyomingites don't pay a lot of taxes, and there are many options that can spare hardworking families from taking on more than their share, although we should take on our share. I'm here to stay. Wyoming is my home. I bought the closed-toed shoes, I bought the snowsuits and the boots, and I planted my flag. Please make decisions that help families like mine continue to enjoy benefits of living in this beautiful state for years to come. God bless Wyoming and keep her wild.
Thank you. Questions? Any questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Who else would like to address the committee? Anybody else? Anybody else? Okay. I think, any final questions from the committee on this topic? You might just stay close by because your input on the structural thing, Dan, is it possible for you to do your presentation? And then we've got the folks from REMI model too. I know they're around here somewhere. I saw that big hair. There it is. How are you? You'll be next after Dan, okay?
Yes. Mr. Chairman, I do have to excuse myself for missing my first gathering meeting. So
Get out there.
All right.
Did you tell Diane Schober that look forward to catching up with her when she's done with that meeting? Thank you.
Thank you, folks.
Give our best to the governor and thank him for his leadership.
Will do.
We'll find you guys if we need you to comment.
Buy me some of the birds, that's right.
Thanks.
Almost.
I'm gonna work on it.
Is this the key to the whole thing?
It was from Dad, so.
Or you're just carrying his water for him?
Do you have more? Oh, no, there's some extras though. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I bet you could get started.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dan Nobligan with the Department of Revenue. My task for today was to start the review of some of the states that and what their tax structures would look like compared to Wyoming, and where I may see some opportunities.
You better speak up, Dan. There's poor people in the back and we don't have.
Okay. I think that the first place to look is a state that is very similarly situated to the state of Wyoming, and has one thing that we don't have, a lack of minimum wealth. And it's the state of South Dakota. They're very close in the way that their taxes are structured to us, and yet they have no mineral wealth. They produce a great deal of revenue from two taxes, sales tax and property tax. That's something we also have. They do not have an income tax. They do not have a either corporate or individual income tax. They do have something akin to the gross receipts tax as it relates to contractors and the labor that they provide. And they are in the gaming industry. And one of the sheets that I'll show you later on points to an opportunity even in the lottery. It's amazing how much revenue they generate from their lottery, and it isn't from your traditional lottery tickets. It's very surprising to me, but we'll check into that in a minute. The other state I looked at is a state that is identical to the state. They have a great deal of mineral wealth, and they also have no income tax. Although you could state that their franchise tax, if you will, is somewhat akin to an income tax on corporations. State of South Dakota is the first place that I looked, mainly because when I looked at the very first sheet that you have in front of you, it shows that they are generating in 2018, fiscal year 2018, $2 billion in revenue. And if you look at the graph to the right of that number, at a time when we were struggling mightily.
Which chart are you going after, Dan? I'm sorry.
This one right here.
All right, everybody, this one. Okay, keep going.
During a time when the state of Wyoming was struggling mightily with its revenue picture, this state was increasing its tax revenue every single year. And if you'll remember from the last meeting we held, there's actually counties in Wyoming that have exactly that same sort of tax picture. Teton County in particular depends not at all on our mineral wealth, but does a great deal of wealth building, if you will, from the tax structure that exists in Wyoming today. When you look at what South Dakota does differently from a revenue picture, it isn't that they have any different taxes, but they treat them differently. From a sales tax perspective, they tax very broadly. Virtually any service that you can imagine is taxed. We tax the repair, alteration, or improvement of tangible personal property and restaurant services. That's really the services that we tax today. They tax legal fees, they tax accounting, they tax architecture, they tax engineering, they tax a lot of the things that have been considered somewhat taboo in this state for years and years and years. So that opportunity is there. And when you consider, and I'll speak back to what Senator Scott asked in a committee meeting, he says, so you're going to generate $45 million with a $20 million price tag in order to get the system up and running. And you generate $1 billion a year in sales tax with the system we already have. And he said, there's a cost benefit associated with that just doesn't seem to add up very well. And I tend to agree with him. We have these things in place. We don't choose to use them as effectively as we could.
So Dan, just to be clear, that reference was with respect, Senator Scott was speaking with respect to the marketplace fairness act?
No, it was the retail fairness, retail fairness act.
Yeah, so the big box tax.
The big box.
Okay.
So what he's saying is you got a lot of costs associated with not generating a whole lot of revenue.
Right.
And that's not uncommon for corporate income tax in this country. When you look around the states that generated one, and one that comes to mind is one fairly close to us, and that's North Dakota. North Dakota has a corporate income tax that generated $63 million in 2019, I believe that was an estimate. So, and it's gone from a high of 239 million to 63 million over a 4-year swing. So it isn't a huge major source of revenue in any state, and including this country. Our corporate income tax does not generate anywhere near the revenue that the individual income tax does for the United States, and a lot of reasons for that. I mean, a lot of it gets baked into deductions that are allowable and things that are loss carrybacks and carry forwards that are allowed. It is set up to really minimize the tax anyway. Even when it was at 35%, the corporate income tax was much less than that. The effective rate of the corporate income tax was much less than 35%. And it's the same in most of the states because they start the taxable income at the corporate level as their starting point. So they don't generate a whole lot of tax from it. In Wyoming, you can compound that by taking that deduction for taxes paid at the local level, adding them back in, and then taking them as a credit. It's going to have a huge impact on even getting a rate that's high enough to really generate any income. And the other problem with it is those numbers are not captured on the corporate income tax return. It is just taxes. It's not sales and property taxes. It is taxes and fees. So other than having a subschedule associated with which taxes it is that they get this reporting on, we have no idea what it ends up being. That's the problem I've been having in trying to develop an estimate for how much a corporate income tax would raise in Wyoming. But sticking to what is going on in South Dakota, very similarly situated to the state of Wyoming, and yet they generate a fairly substantial amount of revenue. Now, one of the reasons that they generate a substantial amount of revenue doesn't even have to do with this $2 billion that's sitting over here. It is in their property tax structure. This sheet here that has the yellow lines on it is, the yellow lines represent the states surrounding the state of Wyoming. The state of Wyoming has a 0.55% effective tax rate on commercial or on residential property. If you take a look at what a $200,000 home in the state of Wyoming would generate in taxes, it's $1,095. If you look at South Dakota, that same $200,000 home would generate $2,426. Now that's based on a 1.21% effective tax rate versus 5%. One of the other states I'm going to talk about is the state of Texas. It's right above the Utah there. It's 1.7% effective tax rate on their properties. A $200,000 home in Texas would generate $3,407 in taxes. There's a place where there's a huge amount of revenue. I'm just saying it's an opportunity. I'm not saying that it's a good idea or a bad idea, but it is an opportunity for capturing some revenue in the state of Wyoming that is not being captured today. These are, when you look at this, the tax structure only has one gap in it, and that is mineral wealth. But for that, they have roughly the same tax structure. The other side of that needs to be looked at is how do we spend their money? We need to find out what their budget looks like as much as we know what our budget looks like to determine are there places where they don't spend the kind of money we do. And I think one of those is education. But I think that we need to look at that as well. And that's the next step in this process is to look at the budget side of it and see what it generates. I don't know that it makes an awful lot of sense to go down the path of looking at states that have an income tax when we have set this state up through our Constitution pretty much prohibit one. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but you're going to generate a rate that's so high in order to generate any money that it's probably going to be looked and frowned upon unless the Constitution can be changed, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. Mr. Chairman.
Oh, sorry. Representative Conley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Noble, I see we were looking at a 2.5 times difference with South Dakota and 3.5 just about with Texas. And that's seductive, honestly, right? But that's only dependent on the number of houses that we actually have. And it's the example with the $200,000 house makes sense if we had a lot of homes. But on the other hand, we're a very low population state. And I think property taxes are paid maybe predominantly by industry. And so I'm curious about thinking about the road that you want us to go down in terms of thinking about residential property when our housing stock is probably pretty low. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Mr. Noble.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conway, this represents a $200,000 home. I use that as a placeholder to show what an increase of, let's just say that you wanted to increase to what one of these states actually charges on their property tax rates. That isn't just for residential homes. Commercial property is assessed at 9.5% in this state as well. So if you raised the effective rate by raising the assessment ratio, you could generate more revenue from that same property, regardless of whether it's residential or commercial or industrial. All right. It just means that you're increasing the taxes to offset some of that difference that we've heard, the $20,000 in services being paid for with $3,000 worth of revenue. I mean, that's the reality of it, is you're trying to shrink that gap. to some extent in order to offset some of the loss that we're going to be seeing from the coal industry in the fairly near future, I would say. It doesn't mean I think we should have South Dakota's tax rate, because that's a lot of money. That's a huge bump in a very short period of time. But the point is, that's how they generate revenue in their state. And I'm just looking at the tax structure that is similar to the state of Wyoming's and how that revenue is generated in that state that is similarly situated. I believe the state of South Dakota has roughly 800,000 residents. We're at 579 or 575 now. So it's a very similar state in structure, in our demographics. The only difference that I could tell is the mineral industry and to some extent gaming.
Back to you.
Sure, yep, thank you. Follow, Mr. Noble, what would be the increase in the residential and commercial rate from the 9.5% to get to the figures that we have right now?
This would just about double it, or a
Double
little bit
it,
more.
It'd be more than, Mr. Chairman, President Conley, it would more than double it. And that would take a huge change in the assessment ratio, because right now, at 9.5%, we probably have to go to 20 to get even close. And I don't know that anybody's even expecting that to happen, but I just recognize that this is a place where that revenue could be made up, at least to some extent.
Thank you.
So just to interject here, to get there is complicated as well, because there are mill levy caps and mill levies assessed by local governments and for schools. And so when you change the valuation factor, you have implications for all those other income streams. So you'd have to figure out a transition mechanism in some cases, or things that have local taxing authority will get huge windfalls. So anyway, it's complicated, but it could be done. Mr. Noble, back to you.
Mr. Chairman, just kind of another point to make. I looked at a number of other states. North Dakota was one that I actually looked at their property tax structure to kind of get a feel for what they do. Their assessment ratio is actually lower than the state of Wyoming. We take 9.5% of the fair market value of the property as the taxable value. They lower fair market value to 50%, and then they apply, I believe, 9.5% to that. So it's roughly 5% is what you're being taxed on. However, what they do in that state is they don't have caps on mill levies. And the average mill levy in North Dakota is 204 mills. And our average is around 68. So they make up for it by actually assessing the mills associated with those properties. And there's a number of ways of doing it. And here's how they structure their budget. The county will go in and say, okay, I need this much money. The mill levies are set to capture that much money. And that's how budgeting is done in some of the other states. So it's a very different process. Our caps obviously prohibit that from happening because they maximize them at, I think it's 12 for the county and 8 for the cities, and I think 43 is the max. And I think there's more mills that can be had on the education level, but the point being, there are caps in place that prohibit that type of a budgeting process. But it is common in other states. So it's something, again, to look at if you're looking to find ways to help provide local governments with ways to have more autonomy, is you grant them that autonomy through their own process, through their own taxes. One of the things that I think is kind of important to look at, and this is on the second page, I think it's listed as page 13 on my handout. It shows the revenues that are generated by each of the different tax types that they have. And it shows a three-year progression, but it also points where did that money go? Sales and use tax at 4.5% in the state of South Dakota all goes to the state. They do not share that state revenue with locals. The locals have their own local option taxes that they can assess as it relates to generating revenue from sales tax. So it is totally separated. As you know, ours is shared. The The four pennies is shared 31% to locals and 69% to the state. Their contractor's excise tax, which, by the way, is fairly hefty as well. It generates $100 million a year. But one of the things you got to understand is their contractor's excise tax is akin to what they would do on the sales tax for the rest of what they offer. It's 2% of the gross contract amount, okay? And it covers the contractor's labor.
We're talking about construction?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
we don't typically tax the labor associated with construction projects in the state of Wyoming. They do. It's based on an excise tax, but it is something that is, it varies from the way that we handle it. They structure it so that it's just a flat 2%. It's really, in essence, a gross receipts tax on that labor. There is an additional $363 million collected for sales to the cities, sales and use tax to the cities. And then they also collect tax for their tribal reservations as well. I think I think there's 5 reservations in South Dakota, and 4 of them are members of a compact that they have with the tribes. That may have actually changed since the last I looked. But
Mr.
Mr. Chairman?
Do they share money back with the tribes? Or?
Mr. Chairman, it's my understanding that if the tax is collected at the tribal rate, the state retains their piece of it, and the tribes get their piece of it as it relates to the, and I'm not sure what the relationship actually is how it's structured, but the tribes are entitled to their own taxes back. They actually collect it on behalf of the tribes.
But just to add on, our tribes don't really necessarily have a legal way within the Wyoming framework to impose such a tax. You know, our sales taxes are at the municipal or the countywide level, so at local government level. Interesting. They might be interested in that, actually.
Okay. But page 2 is basically to show you how the revenues are captured and where those local revenues go. Page 3 was interesting to me because I know there's been an awful lot of discussion about the lottery in the state of Wyoming and the disappointment associated with how much revenue it actually generates. I used to think, well, that's just because we only have 575,000 people and that sort of thing. Well, when you look at the lottery for the state of South Dakota, there's one glaring piece of that is just amazing to me. Video lottery generates, let me see here, $110 million a year in revenue, and the revenue distributed is $109 million of that. The sales of the lottery is $740 million. So it's, I mean, they're making money on the lottery, but it isn't on selling lottery tickets, and it's in video lottery. I'm not even sure what that is. Never done it before because I'm not really into the lottery, but that's where the money's at in South Dakota. As a matter of fact, I looked at their gaming revenue. It's nowhere near what their lottery revenue is.
So is this revenue produced by people doing this in South Dakota, or is it interstate?
Mr. Chairman,
it's got to be interstate, doesn't it?
I would think that it has to be in some way, shape, or form. Yeah. But it is, I mean, by and large, the largest factor in their gaming revenue.
Try to play right now.
Yeah. And when you look at where the money went, 117 million goes to the general fund. So
keep going.
Okay, the last page for South Dakota is property tax, and this is a locally assessed tax. Their tax structure of who pays property taxes is a whole lot different than ours. As you can see, under the first donut graph, owner-occupied pays 39%, commercial 29%, agriculture 28%, utilities 2%, and special assessments. I guess the thing is, I'm not sure how agricultural
property is assessed in the state of South Dakota. I have not figured that out yet, but and I think that what they do is they put the residents on the agricultural property lumped in with the ag land itself as a single category, because otherwise I believe that they assess their property based on its productive value, just like we do for agriculture. I've got to believe that residence has got to be thrown into that number somehow.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Driscoll.
I've got it on South Dakota. They don't do it on ag value. It's a modified. If my ranch in Wyoming, which pays less than $1 an acre a year, was 30 miles away across the state line, it'd be around $5 an acre. It's just that much difference. They don't have a constitutional provision on ag taxes. They run referendums almost nonstop trying to roll them back because they basically break ranches.
Thank you, Senator. Back to you, Dan.
I think it's important to understand that, and the reason that I chose South Dakota is because it is so closely aligned with what we do today. A lot of the very same things that happen in Wyoming are treated exactly the same way as they are in South Dakota. And if what we want to do is change the tax structure without actually imposing some very stiff upfront costs, this would probably be the way to do it. Not saying it's the right way, I'm just saying that it is something to look at as it relates to how we would fill that revenue gap, or a combination of filling the revenue gap and seeing where we can economize on our spending as well. The other state that I looked at is the state of Texas, and it's this last document here. And one of the things that they show in the revenue category, which I did not see in South Dakota, but I would love to see it because I'd like to know how much it is there as well. That's federal income. How much revenue? It's the largest category of revenue provided to the state of Texas over and above their own sales tax. $35 million comes into them in the form of federal income. Now, when you look at how it is paid out, how that revenue is spent, a very large portion of it is in Medicaid and other programs, the prison population. All of that is all subsidized by that federal income. As it relates to the revenues that are generated in the state itself, sales and use taxes is by far the largest, 28 million. Something that surprised me was the fact that oil and gas taxes provide maybe 3, and if you look at both of them, maybe 6% of the total revenue picture for the state of Texas, and I was very surprised by that. The franchise tax, even itself, is not even 5%. They have a lot of revenue categories, okay, but by and large, they depend a great deal on sales tax, and as I showed you on this sheet, at the local level, they depend very heavily on property taxes as it relates to collections and tax at the local level.
Any questions for Mr. Nolan? Questions? What's a franchise tax, Mr. Nolan?
Well, they call it a franchise tax, and really, it's kind of a gross receipts tax, but they allow certain categories for deductions that vary, and it might be for like employment, some employment taxes paid and things like that. They do allow some deductions, but it is a tax on their gross receipts for the year. It's a lot like Washington State has it, State of Ohio, Nevada now has a gross receipts tax. I call it an income tax without deductions, basically. Our franchise tax in the state of Wyoming is more associated with the assets in the state, the assets maintained in the state, and a certain percentage of those assets is subject to our franchise tax.
And in Wyoming, what are you referring to when you say franchise tax? This local municipalities impose a franchise fee. Is that what you're referring to?
No, the franchise tax in Wyoming is associated with the taxes paid at the Secretary of State's office for corporations.
There you go. Thank you. Just being clear about that.
Okay.
Anything for Mr. Nolan? Anything else, Mr. Nolan?
Mr. Chairman, I stand for any questions you may have. I know there's an awful lot more work to do, but I thought it'd be best to start with states that are similar to ours. I will certainly investigate states that have an income tax, and I will still continue working on what I think an income tax will generate, as well as trying to minimize those costs to get a tax like that up and running.
Okay. I don't know, we need to take a break, but does anybody in the audience have public comment on this portion so far? Anybody? Then we're gonna come back, we're gonna hear from the folks from REMI and keep moving. So let's come back at a quarter till the hour, we'll start promptly, okay? Dean, we've got our friends. Dan, you had one more point to make before we go to the next
Yes.
topic? All right, to you.
Mr. Chairman, I spoke with the folks from the mineral industry back there, and they pointed out that Texas is heavily invested in that property tax as well. Or the mineral producers are heavily invested in Texas property tax because they have that discount.
Can we have it quiet back there? We really do want to start on time, okay? Thank you. Back to you, Dan.
Texas does impose a property tax, very similar to ours, but it's based on discounted cash flow. They actually value the reservoir, and mineral industry down there pays an ad valorem tax in addition to the taxes that were on that sheet I gave you. That's all I have.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Noble about that? Thank you, Ms. Noble. And we did flirt with discounted cash flow, and we kind of gave up on it, I think. All right. Welcome. All right. Mr. Peter Evangelakis.
Yes.
How did I do?
Very well.
All right, thank you. Welcome. Tell us about you and your company.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm Peter Evangelakis. I'm a senior economist with Regional Economic Models, or REMI, of some discussion in the previous, some of the energy discussion earlier. So we're happy to be involved in that. And today I want to reprise my role. I spoke in front of the committee last year on the same topic. I'm going to give, I think, a more abridged version to kind of, I guess, set the mood. A lot of what I'm going to talk about has been talked about in some form or another today, so I won't belabor the point. But I do want to talk about the relationship between economic and fiscal diversification, and how we looked at it through the REMI model, and what I think a lot of the conclusions will be fairly intuitive, but it's good to have it backed up by rigorous analysis.
Great. Would it be better to have the lights dim for people, or I'm worried you might drift off, but can you all see it?
Everybody
Members of the
okay?
committee, okay with it? Okay, we're gonna leave lights on.
Excellent. So just a brief roadmap. Today, I want to again look at what are the fiscal impacts of economic diversification efforts in the state under the current tax structure. Obviously, that's been a priority for Endow. Obviously, in talking about some of the coal decline and some of the diversification that would be justified from that perspective as well. Want to understand what are the fiscal impacts of that. The main result that we find doing a couple of different types of cuts of the data or cuts of analysis is that under the current tax structure, efforts to stimulate non-resource sectors, manufacturing, things like that are, I think, of some interest as part of the diversification effort, do present some fiscal challenges. As you might expect, a lot of that is driven by, no personal or corporate income taxes, relatively low sales and property taxes, and obviously a heavy reliance on resource-based revenue. So, the kind of on the revenue side, it becomes a fiscal challenge because if you're bringing in jobs outside the resource sector, and we'll get into this in more detail, but if you're bringing in jobs outside the resource sector, you're having to pay for the services for the folks who come to take those jobs, but then you're not extracting any personal, individual income tax revenue or any corporate income tax revenue from those jobs if they're outside the resource sector. And that therein kind of lies the core imbalance that we'll get into. So we've talked a little bit about REMI again in tax PI in the previous discussion, so I'll touch on it a little bit to give some background, but I won't belabor it. And then we'll talk about two different, I think we can go to the next slide. Yes, there we go. And I'll talk about two different ways we cut our analysis. One was looking at an intervention in a resource sector, the oil and gas sector, versus a manufacturing sector, and looking at the differences in the fiscal impacts across those two. And then kind of along the same lines as Mr. Noble, looking at an intervention in, again, a manufacturing sector, in this case, a non-resource sector, and looking at it under a few different states' tax structures and looking at the difference relative to the Wyoming fiscal results. Go to the next slide. So this is a little bit of background about REMI. We've been around since 1980. We do work all across the country. At the bottom, there are some logos of some of our clients. Of course, EAD is down there. We also work in North Dakota in the departments of revenue across the country. We have, for those of you who are not familiar with REMI, it's kind of an amalgamation of a few different types of models that allows it to have a kind of a more sophisticated dynamic approach to economic analysis. We can go to the next slide. So, and in particular, the model that EAD has in Wyoming is, as Dr. Liu mentioned, the tax PI model, which not only allows for economic and demographic impact analysis, but also to layer on top of that fiscal impact analysis. So at the bottom here, there's kind of a schematic where you can look at changes in, for example, you can think of it in kind of two buckets. One, you can look at what are the fiscal impacts of non-fiscal policies. So an economic diversification or economic development strategy is not a tax policy per se, but you can see what are the fiscal impacts of that. You can actually also look at what is the impact of a tax policy and what are the feedbacks. So if you change a tax policy, that's going to have some change. That's going to have an impact on the economy, on behavior in the economy, which is going to have an effect on the tax base. And so that'll have some dynamic revenue effects. And this model allows you to capture not only the original kind of static impacts, but also the impact, the fiscal impacts of any changes in economic behavior.
Is the PI part personal income?
The PI part is actually policy insight. So our core economic model is called PI plus, policy insight, and so tax PI is policy insight plus tax. So now we'll kind of cut to the analysis. So the first again is going to be looking at comparing two different industries under Wyoming's tax structure. We can go to the next slide. So in last year's presentation, I looked at a few more. I'm going to cut it down to get to the essentials. So I'm going to look at adding 100 direct jobs into two different Wyoming industries, one in the oil and gas sector and one in chemical manufacturing sector, one in a resource-based industry and a non-resource industry. And I'm going to look at the impact on Wyoming's budget and then kind of underlying those budget impacts, both on revenue and spending, what are the drivers of those in terms of the economic production and the tax base and the population, which drives a lot of the expenditure.
Can you give an example of a chemical manufacturing?
So, for example, I know that we worked closely with Dr. Liu and the AD looking at a particular manufacturer maybe a year or two ago. So I think that
drug company.
What's that?
Was this that drug company?
I believe so. Yeah, I don't know how much I should say. So I'm gonna keep it general, but yes.
You shouldn't say anything. I think it's a pharmaceutical company in Cody. So yeah, keep going.
Okay. So let's go to the next slide. Perfect. So what I've done here is these are the revenue impacts of this adding 100 jobs to the oil and gas sector. So we're looking at the resource sector now. The line in red is the revenue impact. The line in green is the expenditure impact. And so what this is looking at is essentially the REMI model is built on a baseline. So we have underlying kind of business as usual projections of the economy. And then we calibrate the state's budget to that. And we have an underlying baseline for business as usual for revenues and expenditures. And here we're looking at in a given year, what is the difference relative to that baseline. So now that we have 100 more jobs in the oil and gas sector, we have this much more revenue relative to what we would have had in the absence of adding those jobs. And so as you can see here, there's a very healthy growth in revenue, as you would expect, given the various sources of revenue for the oil and gas sector in terms of severance taxes in particular. And then you do see growth in expenditures as well. That's largely going to be driven again by the population that moves in to the state to take those jobs and the services that are associated with that increased population. So I'll say so we looked at a 15-year period, so 2017 through 2032. This is analysis we did last year. So if you look at the just to give you a sense of magnitudes, in 2032 that the revenues are $14 million higher approximately than they would have been otherwise, whereas the expenditures are about $6 million higher than they would have been otherwise. So you see there relative growth in net revenue. Approximately 3/4 of that revenue increase in 2032, about $10 million comes from those natural resource-based taxes, so oil and natural gas severance taxes, federal mineral royalties, and property taxes on minerals. And I'll say, the expenditure piece, of course, expenditures are discretionary, so we don't mean to predict exactly what's going to be appropriated. We're looking at, given current levels of per capita spending, we're looking at keeping those relatively constant and looking at the increased population. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you for both the revenues and for the expenditures, just one economic indicator that shows the underlying tax base that drives that. So this first piece I'm going to look at, this is a breakdown of the increase in economic output. This is kind of by industry. So the line at the top you see is going to be the oil and gas sector that's been directly positively impacted. And so you see there a growth. Again, I'm going to quote numbers in the last year, in that 2032 year. So there's about a $70 million increase in output in the oil and gas sector. Again, think about the $10 million generated in revenue. That's about 14% or so kind of implicit tax rate. That's relatively close to what I understand to be the overall kind of severance taxes. And you can compare that, for example, to a 4% sales tax rate or a relatively low property tax rate, and looking at kind of the balance of resource versus non-resource based taxes. And then this is in the next slide. And this is just looking at the impact on the population. Again, you're going to see an increase in the population that's going to be largely driven by job availability. Those new jobs, people are going to come in to take them, and so that's going to drive a lot of the expenditures. So now I'm going to go ahead to the next slide, and now we're going to look. We're going to do the same exercise for the chemical manufacturing sector. Again, we're adding in 100 jobs. And again, the red line is going to represent the impact on revenue, the green line on expenditure. Here you see in the first few years, you do see a net growth in revenue, but after I believe 4 or 5 years, you see the growth in expenditure starts to outstrip the kind of the increase in revenue. So just to put numbers on it again, and again, I'll quote the last year, 2032, the increased revenue is about 3.4 million. That's as opposed to the 14 million that we had with oil and gas. And the increase in expenditure in 2032 is about $5 million. That's in the same ballpark as the 6 million that we saw before. The difference is that $10 million in resource-based revenue is just no longer there. And so after 4 years, you do see a switch where the state starts to, again, keeping per capita spending at roughly the same levels, starts to see, a growth in expenditures that outstrips the revenues that it's bringing in from that increased population. So excellent, we're already on the next slide, perfect. So again, this is the impact on economic output. Again, this is broken out by industry, and again, the top line here is the chemical manufacturing sector that we've directly impacted. We actually see in the chemical manufacturing sector an increase in output in 2032 of about 175 million. There we see a little bit more of an impact, a little bit more than double what we saw with oil and gas. In this case, there's a higher average labor productivity, so the same workers produce, the same amount of workers are producing more economic output, but we're seeing at the same time about double the increase in output, about a quarter of the increase in revenue, and again, that's driven by the heavy reliance on the resource sector. And again, we see in this next slide, if we go to the population, we see a relatively similar increase in population, again, for the same reason, and again, driving that similar increase in expenditures. So if we go to the next slide, so we've now looked kind of within Wyoming, kind of across two different industries. Now what I want to do is take that same chemical manufacturing industry and look at an intervention and compare the impact in Wyoming to a neighboring state. I believe it'll be North Dakota. So if we go to the next slide. Yes, so again, we did this analysis last year also for a couple more states that I'll talk about. Here again, I'm just going to highlight the essential difference. We're going to look at an intervention in the chemical manufacturing sector, and we're going to look at, again, that 4 states. I'll show you 2 of them, and I can talk about the other 2. The ones that I'll show you are a reprise of the Wyoming impacts that you saw very recently, and then a look at the impacts under North Dakota's budget structure. So on the next slide here, as you'll see, a very, very familiar picture. Here, the gray line is the impact on revenues. The yellow line is the impact on expenditures. And so again, you see, for a few years, the revenue impacts are larger than expenditures, but that eventually changes as expenditures continue to grow and the revenue impact flattens out. We go to the next slide. We also looked here at North Dakota, very apropos that we had Mr. Noble presenting on this just before me. In North Dakota, some of the differences that we see with North Dakota, they have between a 1.1 and 2% personal income tax rates, as opposed to, of course, zero in Wyoming. A 5% sales tax rate as opposed to 4% in Wyoming, and between 1.68 and 5.15% corporate income tax rates, again, as opposed to none in Wyoming. And so, again, we see in yellow the expenditures, in gray the revenue impacts. And again, you're going to see, adding jobs is going to add population, and that's going to add to expenditures. The difference here with North Dakota is that they are able to capture some of the revenue from the influx of both the population that takes those jobs, as well as some of the some of the corporate profits that are generated by those jobs. And so in that way, the revenues, the revenue impacts are not significantly larger, but they do consistently outstrip and keep pace with the increase in expenditure. And so there you can see kind of the comparison across the 2 different states in terms of the similar impacts on expenditures, but then the sources of revenue are going to be fundamentally different. So just on the next slide, just to conclude, under the current tax structure, there are challenges in the very necessary effort to diversify Wyoming's economy. And as we showed, it's not an isolated issue. It applies generally across a number of generally across non-resource sectors. And looking across several different states, we see that it's driven by the particular tax structure. So kind of the big picture is, I think it's a really good idea to be thinking about diversification. I think that's an excellent goal. There does need to be some thought, I think, put towards, and I think there is thought being put towards, how to best pair that with the tax structure that's going to make that really possible. So with that, I'll open up to any questions.
Questions? Mr. Co-Chairman.
So it would stand to reason that lack of an income tax is most likely our biggest barrier, where if we had an income tax, our graphs would be more positive. Would that be a fair assessment? Not like the number one thing that would fix us in a perfect world?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I think that would certainly, I mean, that would certainly be a part of it. Yes, that wouldn't be the only solution, but that would certainly change the calculus a little bit.
So follow then. So our perhaps two best solutions or options on the table would be a property tax increase, either valuation or mills or whatever, or corporate income tax. Is there a way to run both of those models and say which might be a better fit economically for Wyoming? I think, the committee can correct me if I'm wrong, but those are maybe our two options. As you heard earlier, income tax is likely not a possibility. Any off the top of you, or just any suggestions you have doing this, knowing what you know about our state, legislatively, politically, recommendations? Lifelines?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I think I would hesitate to speak about particular results, but those would certainly be analyses that we could do, or that we could work with the AAD to do and to assess those options, or the LSO, as appropriate. So those are definitely analyses that we could do. Yeah, so those are things that we could do, and we'd be happy to help work on those.
One more quick one. Okay.
Well, sure.
Well, thanks. Any other idea? I mean, do other states have any type of other options that they utilize in this regard that you would recommend or have us look at besides the basic corporate income tax, property tax, sales tax? Is there anything innovative out there that?
Go ahead,
Mr. Chair. I would want to give that some more thought. I mean, I think certainly, certainly there are taxes that, I mean, I think certainly there are, there are taxes that impact different tax bases, and some of which may be more, thinking politically, which may be more or less palatable politically. I think there are likely innovative solutions. I know we heard in kind of the energy sphere, we heard from Dr. Godby and Dr. Cook earlier, about some innovative ways of raising revenue. So yes, I'm sure there are. I'd be happy to follow up on that.
So, might point in with regard to the income tax, Wyoming's a bit of an unusual case because constitutionally people are allowed to deduct other taxes from that. So I think it might make it a little bit more difficult. I'm not sure. Who had a question down there? Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the modeling, it was 100 jobs per year, or just total flat line?
100 jobs.
Mr. Chair, Representative Sweeney, it was a permanent increase of 100 jobs. So so it wasn't in the second year it was still 100 jobs, and the third year was still 100 jobs. Yeah, it wasn't additive.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Representative Conlon.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm looking at the North Dakota budget, and I'm just curious about one of the last slides, that it looks like the overwhelming increase in revenues come in the first 2.5 to 3 years, and then it pretty much is flatline, and that it's exactly revenue and expenditures equal. So I'm just curious, why does North Dakota see so much in terms of increased revenues early on without that keeping at kind of a slope that would show a kind of continued increase in revenue in relationship to expenditures that I would have assumed would have gone down, to tell you the truth?
Chairman, Representative Connolly. Yeah, when when we look at just in general, when we look at economic impacts of adding jobs, say, that's one of the things that's built into the model response is going to be if you're adding jobs, businesses are expanding, there's going to be some additional investment activity that occurs, and so you'll often see somewhat of a bump in the first few years as you increase employment. Generally you'll need some more capital, so that may generate more investment. So that's generally and I would want to take a look specifically at this just to confirm. That would be my educated guess as to what's going on in those first few years.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
But my point would be that, or it would seem to me that your point would be that we would see the opposite, that the expenditures would be higher than the revenues because of exactly what you're saying. But instead, we're seeing that the revenues coming in are significantly higher in those first few years rather than later on.
Mr. Chair, Representative Connolly, I would need to investigate that specific. I imagine you're looking in particular at that fiscal year 2019 number. That's something that I would probably want to take a look at in more detail. I don't know exactly why it's that large of a gap, but I think generally the kind of the big picture is that you are still seeing with whatever additional activity you're seeing in terms of economic output and population inflow, you're capturing some of that in terms of revenue in a way that is not being captured in Wyoming. So you are there's more of a gap in that year, but I think the pattern in general is that you're able to capture some of that revenue of the folks coming in to take those jobs.
And Representative Conley, to your point, isn't it the same with the chemical plant or
yes,
that there is that gap of positive net benefit in the beginning, and then,
yes,
I mean it's kind of the same thing. It's a little bit more.
Yes, if we go back one slide,
I think that's it.
Yeah. So you see that same relative spike in revenue, and that's largely going to be driven again by that increase, the temporary increase in investment activity.
So that's the primary impact, and some secondary impacts of them coming in, but then it doesn't grow after that, and our tax revenues never meet it.
Exactly. Once, if, for example, you add a certain number of jobs, you need some additional amount of capital, and so it may take a few years, with some accelerated investments relative to the baseline. But once you've reached the capital, the amount of capital that you need for that new level of employment, that economic impact kind of fades away, and so that as a driver kind of fades away, and that's what you're seeing there.
Anybody else? Anybody else? So this was our problem last year. We have a different problem this year. Because we now have the problem that investment in the mineral, that's now a contraction. And we're trying to figure out how to change our tax structure on our existing people or bring in new people that pay taxes. We're trying to figure out how to compensate for that contraction. So it'd be the opposite effect of that. Any thoughts on how that would be modeled?
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Chairman, certainly, looking at kind of the flip version of say the oil and gas or a similar mining sector impact, you do see, that loss in output generating large losses in revenue. Dr. Liu expressed kind of all of the reasons for that very well earlier. Not only the direct severance and other resource taxes, but also those are well-paying jobs. That's less spending in the economy. In terms of bringing in sales tax revenue, property tax revenue. And I'll think back also on again I'll reference Drs. Godby and Cook and thinking about revenue, being able to generate revenue in a way that hopefully avoid some of the trade-offs in terms of disincentivizing new activity into the state. I think that's always the challenge. Especially when the economy is so tied. Both the economy and the budget are so tied into a relatively small set of industries.
And we're okay if we just continue this for a second. Just to continue on that is truly our downfall and a contraction. It can be wonderful in an expansion. We've had expansion for most of the time. We've had some significant, bumps in the road, but we've had expansion for most of our modern history since the 50s. It's a very different situation possibly now with concern about carbon producing minerals. So question we really have is how do we invent a tax structure that doesn't kill Wyoming and yet provides the ability to maintain a level of public services? And it's the flip side of everything you've been talking about, but it's actually the variable we're trying to determine is the appropriate tax structure.
Right. Yes, Mr. Chairman, and to your point, that's we want to continue to be involved in doing this kind of analysis, and I know that as we continue working with the AD, with their having access to the tax PI model, we're able to look at modeling different types of tax structures. What if we were to move to this tax structure, and what impacts does that have both on the economy but also on the budget? And so we look forward to working with the AD and with LSO as appropriate. Using this tool that we have to be able to look at looking at different proposals, either that come from the committee or the governor, or looking at proposals that come from the AD perhaps. But I think that's a large part of our value is being able to run those different scenarios in a dynamic environment and look at not only what are the static kind of first order impacts, but how is this going to affect behavior and in the budget. So we're excited to continue trying to help the state of Wyoming find its way to the best solution.
Okay, anybody else? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Would anybody have any public comment on this piece? Any public comment? Okay, thank you. So excited because it's statement of consideration time.
What, is that Mr. Evangelakis' computer? You live up here?
Is that your computer?
No, that's Steven.
Mr. Tempes?
Okay. Mr. Herzog, welcome.
Good afternoon.
Is anybody joining you, or is this a solo performance?
Well, no, it'll just be me. And thank you for allowing me to come back. I'm as excited as you are about statements of consideration.
Well, you waited a long time.
Well, for some of you who I weren't at Lander, I'll let you know who I am. My name is Marty Hartzog. I'm a member of the Board of Equalization. I was with the Attorney General's office for 17 years and in fact represented the Department of Revenue, Department of Audit, many tax appeals. So I'm very familiar with the system. Governor Meade asked me to join the Board of Equalization 4.5 years ago. And so I have been there ever since. And Jane Mockler, a co-board member, and David Delacath, who also came from the Attorney General's office, extend their apologies. They are at a cabinet meeting right now, I believe. Governor
Sounds like everybody's there.
Governor Gordon's first cabinet meeting.
Yeah.
And I trust you've all seen the most recent iteration. Before, when we brought you this issue, the problem, of course, was people in various counties, and it's not every county, but it's becoming a problem in more and more counties, not submitting statements of consideration and simply claiming an exemption. Under subsection C, you have a whole list of scenarios where the person can simply say, don't have to fill one out. Maybe it's an intrafamilial transfer, or maybe it's a subsidiary transfer, whatever the case may be. But it appeared that people were claiming it just to get out of the requirement. And so we first brought you a solution that would enable the clerks to ask for information to verify justification for the exemption. Give me something so that we know you're really transferring this property and it's not a market transaction. And that was something that you went along with, the 5-4 as I recall. The other alternative was to just take out some of the exemptions, or all of them, because quite honestly, the need for them was questionable. The information is confidential. It's not available to the public in general. The county assessors and county clerks cannot use this information for any purpose other than application of Wyoming system. Since that time, we've come back around and talked with the clerks and the assessors, and we decided to simplify it even more. And so what you have is the LSO version that we have further revised, and it makes it far less radical a change. What we would like to do, and we can go through the bill, but in a nutshell, what we would do is change the statute so that everybody who wants to have a piece of property recorded, and this is what happens. You purchase a piece of property, the first thing you want to do is get your deed on the record so that the public knows that you own that property and you have good faith purchaser status. That's the first thing you do. And typically your title insurance company does it for you, or your real estate agent does it for you. And at that point, the county clerks are required to receive what's called a statement of consideration from you that says how much you purchased the property for. And of course, that's important to the assessors because they use that information to value Wyoming's properties for tax purposes. Very, very important. And so what we would do in this new version is simply require that everybody fill out a statement of consideration, regardless of whether an exemption applies. And that way, they at least have to give the assessor and the county clerk their contact information, their phone number, their address, some way for the assessors to follow up with the person and find out what that transaction looked like. The exemptions we would leave alone, and if they want to claim an exemption and skip that part of the form where they have to indicate how much they received or paid for the property, then that would be fine. They can do that. But this new change would, or this new iteration would simply give the assessor the information from the purchaser and the seller so that they can be contacted, and the assessors have to do this anyway. They have to contact the parties to the transaction to find out what the transaction was like. Because not all transactions are used in the evaluation analysis. Obviously, if it's a non-arm's length sale or if it's a non-market transaction, the assessors are instructed to not use those in their analysis. But the information is valuable to the assessors nonetheless. So that's it in a nutshell. We can go through it. There are some other changes that we would make. One of the changes would be for structures on lands not owned by the transferring party. We have a lot of cabins and such that are on, and under the old version of the statute, these folks were not technically required to submit a statement of consideration. Makes it very difficult for the assessors to value those properties because they are very, very desirable, and they transfer possession quite frequently. And so the assessors, we were hoping to improve the statute to include that scenario. So anyway, when you go through, you will see the LSO version. I've double stricken the language that we would change. And again, the key is to get the contact information for the parties to the transfer so that the assessors can simply follow up with them and get that information. If they have an exemption and don't want to provide the consideration on the form, they can still claim that, and the clerks are in this way taken out of the equation. They still receive the document, but they don't have to confront the submitting party. They don't have to say, okay, you gotta show me that this is really an exempt transaction, or I'm not gonna take your document for recording. And then the other changes are
Can you
really.
wait a second? Mr. Co-Chairman.
Process question I want to understand. So working draft 4 is from LSO, what we agreed upon last meeting. And then 4B is also from LSO, or this is Mr. Hartzog took on his own volition to edit your writing and turn it into a.
The B version is from the state board.
Are you okay with that, Josh? Or you kind of upset by that?
I'm fine with it, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I didn't have a lot of time, and this kind of came out a little late in the process, but we wanted to cover the clerks, and the clerks, even though they support the direction that we presented in Lander, and in all fairness, they didn't want to have to confront submitting parties and say, well, I don't think we're going to receive your document for recording because you haven't shown me that you're truly exempt, and I agree with that. So I think this is a better version because the assessor is the party who really needs it. Unfortunately, it all goes through the clerk. The clerk is the access point, and we don't have a system where they would have to file it with the assessor's office. And the statutes, I mean, you would have to revise a lot of statutes to do that. So this is the best we can do with the structure we have, but it puts the assessors on the hot seat in terms of trying to track down whether a transaction is exempt or not. So, but the important part of it is they have that contact information. Right now, if a party claims an exemption, the assessors have nothing. No identity of the parties, I mean, they have to then basically start calling and hoping that a realtor or a title insurance company will work with them and give them information that they don't have at hand. So, and what, as I was going to say, the other two changes are fairly basic, and I think everybody was on the board with them. We were going to change some language which didn't quite read right, and then the other part was to move subsection G, which is something that had been put in place to help protesting taxpayers gain access to the comparable sales. So rather than put it in Title 34 where they would never look for it, we asked that you take the entirety of subsection G and move it over to Title 39, right with the balance of the protest provision. So that's what this does.
So that language is the same?
It's the same. And as you can see, it's under A, so it allows the person who's appealing to see that they can go to the assessor and get a copy of the statements of consideration. The assessor then has to get a promise, a document executed by the party, the protestant, promising that he will not share that information because it is confidential, and then they are liable if they share that information. But that's so that they can look at what the assessor used to value property, and that was done to approve the protesting party's ability to litigate if they wanted to.
So you were talking about two things, and the first one you went over quickly. What was that?
The first part was just, it was language that didn't quite read right, Mr. Chairman, and if you look at it, you can see it, it's, let's see.
You can never find it when you need it.
Yeah, it's in subsection E.
Okay.
And you can see the changes, and these are the original changes that LSO had made, so this hasn't changed at all.
Okay.
And if you read it, just read it to yourself, you can see that you almost trip over it, it doesn't quite flow. And so all we did is rewrote it to get to what you were trying to do, and it flows. It doesn't change substantively anything.
Okay.
And I will be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, Representative Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rizal, on page 2, line 12, 13, and 14, I'm wondering why we're including any earnest money or other consideration paid to be held by the property. That would actually be the price paid for the property. Why do we need to know that? Why do we have to have that in statutes?
Interesting. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Blackburn, the concern came up that sometimes the structure of the earnest payment, which usually blends right into the ultimate consideration paid, wasn't always there for the assessors to see. And then, so there was a part of that puzzle missing sometimes. And whatever they got at the end wasn't fully describing the consideration paid. If the committee wants to come up with something, you could just say, or other consideration paid. The idea is that the assessors just want to know 100% of what was paid for the property. Because if they don't have that, then the sale value is not going to work. They have to know how much was exchanged or bargained for the property. And that just ensures that if it's not at all in that final price, if there's something up front that is part of the entire bundle of sticks paid for the property, they have to provide that information.
I think you had that covered, Mr. Thomas, the verbiage before, the actual full amount paid or paid for the property, period. I see no reason to have the earnest money. I mean, I've done real estate transactions where I've taken cars, or never horses or chickens, but I've taken cars. And had to put that is still the full price of the house, no matter where I took a car. Valued at $500, and the property was valued at $100,000. It was still the full price paid was $100,000. I don't necessarily think it's government's business whether I took a car, chickens, or a horse.
Mr. Herzog. Do you have an animal metaphor to do?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Blackburn, I don't know that I have a specific. I do know that sometimes there are intangibles that go into the equation, and it's in some way, even that scenario where it's a very odd or abstract type of consideration, if the assessor doesn't know that, then they have an incomplete picture of the transaction. And all I'm relating to you is what the assessors have discussed as a periodic problem. I think if this is a stickler, if the committee isn't comfortable with that, I certainly don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I want to see this go through, and we would certainly be happy with everything in it minus that language. But it's just an attempt to be comprehensive in getting all of the information that is representative of the consideration paid. It's just as simple as that.
So, Mr. Herzog and Josh, I know you've got something. Did you need to jump in?
Mr. Chairman, if you had any questions about what had changed between the two versions, but I think it's fairly clear.
Okay, thank you, Josh. So, Mr. Herzog, how does it work when sort of a contract for deed with a payment out schedule? I don't work in real estate very much, but so then you have the full price. Well, what is the full price? You've got a note and you've got some kind of down payment. The note has interest, but is interest part of the price? I'm confused on that.
Mr. Chairman, that's an interesting question, and there's a lot of legalities tied into your question, because if you had a contract for deed, technically, depending on how it's drafted, you don't have a transfer of title until the deed is paid.
Completed. That's true.
And there's a trustee and so forth, and you have, I drafted many of these.
But it could be another financial deal where the deed did change.
Yeah, and so what you would have to do is wait until there's an actual transfer of legal title. And in that situation, that's one of those instances where the assessor has to be able to look at it from the 30,000 foot point from underneath, from the sides. And then I can tell you what happens in most of those cases where they're not, where it's not easy to see how the consideration was structured. Those transfers are likely just eliminated from the analysis. It's because what happens is when in deciding whether a sale is to be used in the analysis, it's all about the timing. If it's too old, then it doesn't reflect the value, the fair market value at the time that the property is taxed, which is January 1. And so assessors have to use lots of different ways. They time trend. They do a lot of different things to try to bridge that gap in time. But if a transaction is such where there's lots of moving parts and it's not easy to identify a value to each component, I suspect that those types of transactions are eliminated. But the important part is that they get access to that information, because in some of these counties, as you know, Niobrara County, where there are hardly any sales, and we just finished our abstract hearings last week, and there in some of these counties, you had a total of 20 sales for the entire year. And how does an assessor get to, use 5 sales and use the mass appraisal system to adjust for market value movement with 15 or 20 sales. And so to eliminate these from the picture and not allow assessors to have all these transactions is really hamstringing. But I do agree with you, there are some like that would likely be eliminated from the discussion.
Yeah, seems like another opposite one would be where you agree to pay so much and you pay it in equal installments, and there's no implied interest rate. The deed is transferred up front.
Yeah.
I mean.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think, the different types of financing structures and the different way that this can be done, the assessor has to follow very, very structured guidelines from the department as to what kind of transactions they can consider. And if they can't put a price down at a certain time where both parties were of mutual intent to exchange for consideration, then but the board or Department of Revenue has instructed that in most of those instances, you don't use those sales.
Anybody else? Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thanks. Can you talk to me a little bit about why it's important we include any earnest money or other consideration paid to hold the property as part of the information given? Because right now it's actual full price to be paid, that was paid or will be paid, but now you have to disclose. Was that your total question? I was still thinking about my last job. I couldn't figure out why everyone was laughing at me. I liked your question so much it just kind of.
Mr. Chairman, you were hanging on my last point. I'm sure you were trying to digest the area part.
It was a good answer. I must have missed that too.
That was verbatim.
Sorry.
Let's not do it again. We'll let you listen to the tape.
I did that last lander too, didn't I?
So, you started early and hard today. I mean, you could just put a sentence in there defining that full price means all everything paid for the property. You could do that.
I don't think you need.
Yeah, so if somebody wants to offer them, they could. It's okay. All right. Anything else? Any other questions? Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hutzak, how much revenue are taxpayers foregoing with this statement of consideration ballpark?
Mr. Herzog.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, I have no idea. It's more of a problem in some counties than others. I think it's a situation where there's an influence, and I'm not sure what it is, but it's becoming more and more of a problem across the state. In terms of how much revenue, how could we tie a revenue loss to this? I don't think that that's the right way to look at it. The better way to look at it is the assessor has a limited number of sales, especially in these counties where there are hardly any sales. And as the assessors are going to tell you, they have to stratify. They have to put properties all in groups of similar quality. And if you're trying to structure it so that you have 5 sales, and if you're not considering all of the available sales, then the assessors are really scrambling to try to understand what the market is doing in that locality, or they're not making adjustments at all. And then what you'll have happen is properties aren't changing in value with the actual market because they're not getting enough sales to look at. Everything has to be tied to sales or some empirical indicator, because when the assessor goes in on an appeal, they can't just say, well, I thumbnailed it and I gave it my best shot. They have to go back to the rules and say, this is how I did it and why, and these are the sales that I used to value your property. And so in terms of the revenue impact, I can't answer that question. It's just the difficulty assessors face in trying to come up with 5 sales to value all properties in the state.
Go ahead.
Follow, Mr. Chairman?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I certainly understand kind of you have to frame this in a larger context, but doesn't this ultimately lead back to foregone revenue for the counties and local municipalities? Because that's obviously, given the mill levy system that we're on, I think that the long-term ramifications can be reflected in foregone revenue to at least a certain extent.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, I don't think so. I think what you quantify it by saying the values are not accurate. And the assessor is literally going to say, I had 5 sales in the last 10 years. And we just don't get many sales of this kind of property. And the inability to look at sales that may have been applicable, but they couldn't see them because there was no statement of consideration. This is literally just the main tool that the assessors start with. When a sale happens, they get this document and they say, okay, we have a sale of this property on this date for this amount of money. And a good chunk of those sales they throw out anyway, because they're just like the chairman said, they have, there's been a substantial change in the nature of the property. Maybe they added a garage on, so when it was sold before and it sold this time, it's not apples and apples, it's apples to oranges. But to have not available those sales in a particular area is a tremendous hardship to the assessors. And so in a county like Laramie, where you get literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sales every year, not a big problem. But in your smaller counties, and especially where you have rural properties, it's a significant problem to not have all the sales available for your analysis.
So we do have, I know Ms. Sexton's here, so we might hear from an assessor.
My sister's here.
Everyone's in trouble. Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you. Along those lines, you mentioned hundreds and hundreds of sales. Do you have a spreadsheet of like how many sales occurred, like in Laramie County versus Teton County or Turner County? Do you have that? You could get us at some point?
Mr. Chairman, absolutely. Representative Ellis, we have that every year. We have a breakout of all of the sales by county, and then as well as that, all of the sales they actually used by county in each type of property class. You have 4 classes of property in any kind of analysis. You have residential improved, residential vacant, commercial improved, commercial vacant. And we can look at the numbers of sales in every category and how many that actually made it into the analysis. And of course, our role is to have a statistical analysis. We don't get down into the weeds and look at the actual sales unless we really have to. Ours is the 33,000 foot view, and we're looking at it from a statistical standpoint to make sure that all of the values are running within a range compared to the sales in a given strata. It's a lot to say and consume in one's thought, but that's how it works. But we can certainly get that for you, yes.
Senator.
Just a follow-up question. I mean, I'm looking at your website for just documents available, and I think you usually produce an annual report, but it looks like the last one was for 2016. Is that the normal lag that you have, or do you have your more recent documents available on your website?
Mr. Chairman, I'm sure we have it. If it's not up on the website, we can put it up. We've been doing a lot of things with our website and trying to improve it. You would be amazed at how things change whenever you have new board members and we sit down, and things do change quite a bit. Now, all of our orders are online. We actually included a spreadsheet with all of the county values and comparing those, but I can make sure that's uploaded for you.
For everybody, Mr. Herzog. Representative Conlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Herzog, I was actually thinking about Representative Western's question about loss of income and revenue. But in my mind, this bill is not really about revenue. And tell me if I'm right or wrong here about thinking about these changes in the statutes are about fairness and equity instead of revenue. And the fairness being that if an individual or a corporation is taking an exemption, that it's an exemption that is accurate. And so that would be the fairness, because Representative Western shouldn't be paying, and I could just waltz in and say, well, I get an exemption, even though we have exactly the same thing. That wouldn't be fair. And then the equity issue is your point about going across county, that a county as large as this one, things are working fine, but you go up a county, it might not be because they don't have the information. So is that a correct interpretation of at least the changes, that portion of the changes in the bill?
Mr. Herzog.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Connolly, you nailed it right on the head. This is not about revenue. And understand the function of the Board of Equalization. We wear 2 hats. We're Wyoming's tax court. So we hear all property tax appeals, whether they are state assessed from the department, that's the mineral taxes, and state assessed taxes such as pipelines and such. We are also an appellate court, and we hear appeals from the county boards of equalization. The county board hears it first, and we do a record review and sit as an appellate body But our second hat is we regulate, in effect, all of the assessors. And we sit down with them every year and we go over their practices and we go over their evaluations and look at it from a statistical standpoint. But so along those lines, I'm here as an advocate for the assessors, not as the court who reviews their decisions, but to help them do their job more efficiently. And what you said exactly describes the point. We have some county assessors that don't struggle at all with statements of consideration because they get so many sales. But as you know, Wyoming is the most sparsely populated state, and we have 23 counties, and many of them have very large rural areas, and they struggle to get enough sales data to value effectively according to the Department of Revenue. And so this is hopefully going to strengthen or enable an assessor in a sparsely populated rural county and to allow them to do their job as well and effectively and quite honestly as easily. And it's not easy, but it shouldn't be made harder because folks are just deciding through maybe bad advice or whatever the reason to not give that information and are claiming that exemption improperly. This allows the assessor and puts it back on the assessor to say, okay, I didn't get the sales data, the transfer information, but at least I know who we're dealing with. I can call them, I can call the realtor, I can call the seller, I can ask them point blank. And then I'll tell you what happens, at some point, the assessors just got to value it with the information they have. You've heard the word BIA, best information available. And then the property owner is going to be in, if they don't like the value, saying, hey, you overvalued my property. And at that point, they have to provide the information because then they're in a litigation. So, yeah, I couldn't have described it better than that. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Sounds really be nice to hear from you.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So to be accurate, then this statement of consideration is not mandated on every sale unless the county assessor says to closing agent or title company, in Natrona County, we're going to have statements of consideration on every transaction. Is that what I'm to understand, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman, no, that's not quite right. Your law right now says that a county clerk will not, except for recording, a deed or an instrument, that's the word in the statute, unless a statement of consideration is executed. That's what the law says right now. But then you go deeper in the statute and subsection C says, however, if your transaction is one of these, and there's a list of 8, and it includes things like family transfers, gifts, transfers between subsidiaries and parent companies, then you don't have to do one. But the default is, yes, you have to submit a statement of consideration. Everybody does who wants to have their document recorded. And so all we're trying to do is basically bifurcate the system. And maybe that's not the right word, but we're trying to say, you're going to submit a statement of consideration in every case. But if you have an exemption, just exclude the part where you tell us how much you paid for it or how much you sold the property for. That you can exclude because that's what the exemption is there for anyway. It's so that you don't have to tell the state about your family transfer or whatever. But at least with this version, the assessors can then ask a question and find out who the parties were. Right now, if they claim an exemption, whether it's justified or not, the assessor doesn't know who the parties are. Has no idea.
How about if we get some public testimony? What do you guys think? All right.
How about the assessor?
I was just going to say, Mr. Chairman, it'd be great to hear from the assessor first.
I expected them to be first in line. They're public too, and elected officials and everything.
And everything.
Ms. Huxtable, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm going to stay up here just in case.
You bet.
You, Dixie.
Great. Mr. Chairman, Dixie Huxtable, Commerce County Assessor, and currently representing the Assessors Association. Thank you to State Board of Equalization for working on this bill for us. First and foremost, we have counties that get every single statement of consideration with every single deed. We have counties that get none. And right now, the law allows for that based on that exception as Todd just explained. Our problem is without that statement of consideration, without the contact information, when I get that deed, I don't know who to mail the bill to, let alone whether the sale was valid or not. In some cases, I don't even have a contact information, and I'm starting the phone tree to find out who those are. So the real crux of this is to try to get the contact information. We're not asking at this point to validate any of the financial information, and if the transaction is exempt under one of the current statutes, and we're not changing those exceptions, we're not asking for the financial information. We're just saying we need contact information so that we can contact the buyer and or seller. And in regards to the earnest money or any other consideration paid to hold the property, we currently, under the statement of considerations, get financing information. If it's not an exempt transaction, we ask for that financing information because the financing information can influence the sales price. It often does influence the sales price. So we want to know if there was any special financing that influenced that sales price. The reason we ask for it in here is because we have people filing the SOCs and putting the amount paid as the balance after the down payment. So they don't consider the down payment or the earnest money as part of the full consideration. Now, I would think it would be self-explanatory when it says the actual full amount paid, but they're not doing that. So we just thought putting this in the language made it very clear what we were trying to get at. We're not asking whether you treated a cow or a car or whatever. We're just trying to get the full information.
Go ahead, Representative Blackburn.
So what you're telling me is a title company doesn't give you that information when they close on that property. Is that what you're telling me?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Blackburn, in some cases that is absolutely correct. In my county, I have people that have filed these documents that won't give it to me because they say currently they don't have to.
Follow up.
Go ahead.
So the title company's refusing to give you that information. So wouldn't it be a lot easier instead of all this bill, just to write a bill that says everybody will submit to whoever a statement of consideration? Would that make sense? Does that make sense?
Ms. Sexwell.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Blackburn, that's what we were trying to accomplish with this bill, is that everybody has to file the statement of consideration with every transaction.
Okay.
And then they can exempt information if it's appropriate. That's what we were trying to do. If that's the way it didn't come across, I apologize.
Okay. Any questions for Ms. Sexwell? Questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Who's that? Representative Sweeney.
So this, I took this at first basically as a problem, not really a problem, but estate planning and transferring of family assets such as a ranch or a cabin. And you're saying that it's beyond that. It's not just related to the ranching community, that it could possibly be a commercial property, that you're not getting all the information.
Ms. Sexwell.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, that is correct. Ranchers are probably the best reporters of this, not the sales price, but they are the best reporter of the statements of consideration. I have industrial companies, I have commercial individuals, and quite honestly, it is their agents, whether it be the title company or the realtor or whomever that's not filling this out and saying they don't have to. When we finally get the name of the person that we need to contact, they've been told they don't have to fill it out because there's an exemption. And then we start the process of what was the transaction, what created the exemption. Selling your ranch is not an exception to filing a statement of consideration. Selling your ranch to your daughter might be an exception to the financial portion. But this is way past that stage. This is becoming exponentially worse every year. And as Mr. Hartsock stated, we have counties that have very few sales. And we do not set a value based on a sale, but we use those sales in our mass appraisal analysis. So every sale that's valid is important.
Further questions for the assessor? Further
Mr.
questions?
Chairman,
Senator Ellis.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you have like some spreadsheet numbers to give us a sense of how bad the problem is, or give us a sense of what counties are struggling with this?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, I don't have it with me, but I can get it for you. As I said, I have probably, I'm roughly gonna say about 50% that have no problem because their clerks, county clerks have taken it upon themselves to require it. Whether they legally could or not, they have. And then we have about 50% that don't. So I'd be happy to get you information. Thank you.
Anybody else? Why don't we hear from other people in the public about this topic? Mr. McVeigh.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Stay close. We'll do Ms. Everguy, then we'll do Ms. Arnold.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Lori Urquhart representing the Wyoming Realtors, and
Love that stripe thing you got going.
thank you. I didn't want to be missed in the back, so of course. Anyway, so first I do want to clarify that realtors very rarely ever take the deed to the county clerk's office to be filed. We're not involved in that process. That's a title company or the buyer themselves. We don't prepare the deed. We don't prepare the statement of consideration. And if I know of any realtors that literally are advising clients or customers to fraudulently claim exemption, I'd want to know who they are because I don't believe that's truly happening that way. It would be a violation of our code of ethics, which could get them censored, fined, suspended, and or expelled from the realtor organization, which means they would pretty much be out of business because they would not have access to our MLS or any of our forms. So we take that seriously, and we're not. Before the May meeting, which I apologize I wasn't there, I did reach out to realtors across the state to find out if this was a concern or if this was happening a lot. Is this a practice in one county and not in another? And the only comment that most of them just said, no, well, of course, everybody has to fill out a statement of consideration unless it is exempt. And so they were kind of like, what are you talking about? But I did get one reply back from a realtor in Cody, and he said that he indeed, about a year ago, took a deed to the courthouse for the buyer because it was a cash transaction, and the buyer was from out of town. And there was, so he did take it, and he did not take a statement of consideration because the buyer told him that his attorney had assured him that he did not have to file one in Wyoming. So it's not coming from the realtors or the real estate licensees for them. It's not my understanding that's what's happening. But, so to this specific bill, on page 2, I don't know that you really need contract for deed in there because it does say existing language says on line 2, when a deed, contract, or other document that would include a contract for deed. So I don't know that that's necessary, but it doesn't really make any difference to me one way or the other. I absolutely agree with the assessors that they need that contact information. I can't imagine the hassle they must go through to try and find where they're supposed to mail this tax notice or tax bill the next year if they don't get any of that information. And on the deed itself, it'll have the name of who it's going to, but not necessarily a mailing address or any kind of contact. So I absolutely agree with that portion. And I don't think there's any reason that any buyer would not be willing or should hesitate to not give that to them. I mean, it's just common sense. So I have no problem with that at all. On lines 12 and 13, including any earnest money or other consideration paid to hold the property, that kind of bothers me, again, because they're supposed to put the actual full amount paid, and that would include, but the earnest money part bothers me the most. I would prefer it said including down payment or other funds. Because earnest money is what we put in our trust account. Sometimes that earnest money is actually given back to the seller or given back to the buyer. It's to hold the property, but it's not part of the purchase price. I had an agent once that took a set of china for earnest money. And then it was given back after they completed the transaction. So earnest money is not necessarily always part of the total purchase price. So I would prefer that language come out of there. Other consideration, and if you want to say including any down payment or other consideration, but not to hold the property and not the earnest money. That language does bother me. But the rest of it, I absolutely agree with the assessors. They have to have that information. And basically, that's what this is doing, is just getting them the basic information they need so that they can contract and then find out if it is indeed an exempt transaction or if it's not exempt.
Thank you. Questions from Ms. Overcutt? Questions?
Mr. Chairman,
Please,
thank you.
oh, Senator Ellis.
Thank you. Can you comment then on the subsection C on page 3? If you have a preference of keeping the existing language or this proposed language, do you have a preference between the two?
Ms. Overcutt?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I think the new language reads okay to me. I mean, and I'm not real clear. I don't have.
Are you talking about E, Senator Ellis?
E or C?
Mr. Chairman, subparagraph C,
Okay, thank
lines
you.
4 through 14.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, may I just,
Tag on.
I'm not sure if Ms. Urbakite has the 4B to be answering your question or
The double
the 4 version.
Mr. Chairman, I do have 4B.
She's very current.
And the double strikeout, I'm understanding that, so that's striking out some proposed language from the last meeting that's not even in statute
I
yet?
think that's Mr. Herzog's strike to whatever was there before.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have any problem with the new language, lines 9 through 14.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Keep going. Anybody else? Anybody else?
Done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think you're second in line, I'm sorry. But Ms. Arnold was next. She pulled her way up there, my bad.
Mr. Chairman, Brenda Arnold, Property Tax Division Administrator. Just hoping to provide a little clarity. When we went to the fair market value system of taxation in the early 90s and our constitution changed, it was actually 1985 is when we first started being required to provide statements of consideration whenever deed transferring equitable title was recorded in the county clerk's office. From 1985 to 2003, there were no issues with that. Every single document that was recorded in the clerk's office transferring title had a statement of consideration. If the, we call it exemptions, at some point they were called exclusions, but basically where that section C that you referenced, Senator, the current language is this section does not apply to, and then there was the 8 exemptions or exclusions or basically situations where you weren't required to file a statement of consideration. But the crux came with an AG opinion. In 2003, a county clerk asked the AG's office, wait a minute, since the law says this section does not apply to these transactions, they don't have to give a statement of consideration if that is applicable. Is that correct? The AG said, that's absolutely correct. So it was in 2003 that assessors started seeing that deeds were being recorded with no statement of consideration accompanying those. So at that time, the State Board of Equalization, recognizing that this was a concern, put together some procedures where a county assessor could send a follow-up letter. It's, it looks like Joe Smith was the grantor, Bill White was the grantee. We can't tell what relationship there may be and why there was no statement of consideration. So we'll start sending letters to these folks and seeing, okay, either you fit one of these circumstances or could you please complete the statement of consideration? As you can imagine, it's caught on through the years. I'll just eliminate having to give them any of that information by saying that I meet one of the criteria and I won't file one at all. So what this bill is trying to do is put back in place the process that was used from 1985 to 2003, where you just have to accompany a document with this statement of consideration. You may not have to give any of the information, and that was the intent of the new language. The stricken language that's in 4B, all of the red, that was adding language and now being removed in this draft. So the current law says this section does not apply to those 8 situations. What this bill is trying to say is you still have to file the statement of consideration. But if you're one of those 8 sections, you don't have to give the amount paid or the consideration exchange for the property, the terms of the sale, which is exactly how it was administered from 85 to 2003. And I hope that provides some
Questions for
clarity.
Ms. Arnold? Questions for Representative Blackburn?
Thank you, Ms. Hall. So was the verbiage in the old 85 to 2003 law including any earnest money, page 2, line 12 and 13? I can't imagine. I don't remember because I was in real estate from 85 to 2003.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Blackburn, no, I mean, the language that you see in the law today is the same language that was there in 1985. And I really do think that what the assessors are trying to ensure is that if I'm using that sale price in my analysis, is it really apples to apples? Do I really understand, was it an open market sale? But certainly with the statement that says at the end there, current law, that goes on to say terms of sale and an estimate of the value of any non-real property included in the sale, that would even cover your example that you provided earlier. And again, the assessors have procedures in place to verify sales information and reach out to their buyers. And I think that this just ensures that our, what is truly the basis of our property tax structure in Wyoming, that we have all the most accurate and current information available to the assessors.
Okay. Anybody else? Thank you, Ms. Arnold.
Thank you.
Next, I'm sorry. Welcome. I should remember your name and I'm sorry.
Deborah Lee, Laramie County Clerk, representing the County Clerks Association.
Welcome.
Thank you. The County Clerks Association supports version 4B, done by the State Board of Equalization and the Assessors Association, principally because it removes from the bill the clerk's responsibility to make judgment calls about the sufficiency of the statement of consideration. We felt very uncomfortable with us being placed in the position to make judgment calls about the statement of consideration.
Okay, questions? Looks like you got a home run.
Thank you.
Thank you. Here's Big Ag. Mr. Marlene. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau. I know I'm disappointing the hell out of a lot of you folks, but you didn't think you were going to have to listen to me today. Hopefully I'll be brief. Page 7, item C on lines 5 through 8. Geographic area may include any area requested by the property owner within the boundaries of the county where the subject property is located. I don't understand, and I'm very green on this, but I don't understand how helpful that's going to be to anybody. You know, for an example, somebody could be looking, want to get comparables. They have a house right outside of Laramie, and then they want to look at comparables to, I don't know, Baldwin, Rock River. To me, that any place within a county is so broad that I don't know how it would be useful to the parties that are trying to come up with values. With that, Mr. Chairman, I don't know who that question is directed to, but anyway, that was a question that I had. Without
Actually, hang right there. Who would like to address that question? Anybody help me with that?
Mr. Chairman, you did catch me a little bit off guard, but that's not a change in the law. We just moved that language from one section
Right.
of the statutes to another, so that's not a change.
And you broke it up into subset pieces, but yeah.
Correct. That has to do with somebody that's going to appeal their value, having access to all of the sales that would apply to,
anywhere within the county.
that would have been used to establish their value. And so, if we use the geographic area to set your value, then this would cover that geographic area, that you can see all the sales information in that geographic area.
Mr. Co-Chairman wants to weigh in.
So question, the term has been used before, but this is the first time I see you defined it, unless it's defined outside of this bill somewhere. Would that be a true statement? Or Josh has an answer to that one apparently.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Josh.
It's currently defined in 34.1.142, G3, and actually, the way this bill's drafted, it still stays there, defined in Z3, and would also be defined the same way.
And G3 is not in our bill.
Correct, so if you look on page 5, line 4, you see that introductory language. So there's the number 3 there. We added a 4 that would be stricken out, but that 3 would be right there. And that's.
And it doesn't get moved.
And it also gets now moved to 39, so it's defined in both places, but it's the same definition.
Okay. Thank you, Josh.
I apologize.
Does that help you out?
No, I still think it's a rather awkward way of.
It's old language.
It's old language. To me, and maybe it is workable, but to my redneck mind, it could just muddy the water worse than.
So I understand where you might want to look at property no matter where it was, and this defines it to be within the county. But I didn't understand your point about it being some subset of the county would be better, is kind of what I thought you were saying.
Well, and I guess it depends if you're the buyer or the seller.
Yeah.
If I'm the buyer, I would want to include areas where, again, using an extreme example of Bosler, a house, same size, same amount of acreage, at Bosler wouldn't have the value that it would right outside of Laramie. So to me, that wouldn't be a really good, true comparable. If I was a seller, I dang sure wouldn't want to have that in there because I'd want to get the higher value. So I don't know. I guess if it works now, it works now. And I'm sorry I muddied the water, Mr. Chairman.
It's also may include.
But
so it doesn't say that that's a definitive.
But it may be included by the person contesting, I guess. So
Yes, this is in your rights as a contestant.
Yeah,
So
I guess to me it's.
So wouldn't you like to have as many ability to bring as much stuff as you
Well.
could? Chicken coops.
Well, it depends, sir. If I'm in Bosler, I don't want Laramie values.
But you're the taxpayer complaining, so you get to
Right.
decide. So it's only going to work to your advantage. If it's not to your advantage, you're not going to bring it in.
I hope.
I don't know.
Given my luck, I would. Thank you. I apologize, Mr.
No, it's
Chairman.
okay. Anybody else for Mr. Moline? Anybody else like to address this other bill? Ms. Arnold?
Mr. Chairman, just to address, in 1996, you see the language that's in G, and you'll find throughout that language that we're moving now in the new bill to Title 39. But Mr. Chairman, you'll find the terms review, contest, geographical area. They're all in that appeal provision, and so the feeling of the legislature at the time was that it needed to be defined, all 3 of those terms. But prior to this language being in statute, the only thing that the assessor could disclose were the sales or statements of consideration that were actually used to value the property. And we had a discussion at the legislature where you had property owners that said, okay, I know which ones they used. I want to see the ones they threw out. And that's where this whole language and that discussion came in. So hopefully that provides clarity as to why those terms are in there. The public just needed to know, if I'm going to ask for a review, what does that mean? What does contest mean, and what's a geographic area? So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Anybody else like to address the committee on this bill? Anybody else? So I think we had a dual notice on this. We could make any modifications and kick it to the next meeting, but we have a motion to move it on to the next meeting.
So I have a question.
Go ahead.
So Josh, has Elsa reviewed, this is just from last week, the
Yeah.
changes Mr. Hart, I mean, have we tracked it and?
I was thinking it would go to, this would not be the final bill,
Okay.
but let's kick it over.
And I'll,
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we've not done a review of this change.
okay, I have you review it at September meeting.
And so you propose to use Mr. Herzog's
Yes.
version. Are there any other changes that they'd like to make? Mr. Blackburn, Representative Blackburn, would you like to propose anything about
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I would.
page 2?
Page 2, line 2, strike contract agreement.
Second.
Okay, let's just deal with that one first. Any heartburn out there for that? Any heartburn, seeing none? All those in favor of striking contract with D signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? That's gone. What else you got? Anything else in that paragraph?
Page 2, line 12.
Yep.
Strike including any earnest money, from including any, all of line 13 and property on line 14.
Representative Blackburn, would you consider, I'm gonna offer something friendly, just, what if you took that sentence that said, the one that's underlined, including any earnest money or other consideration paid to hold the property, and just change it to including all consideration paid, period.
Okay, I'll do that.
Is that okay? I think it gets around, what do you guys think out there in the audience? It's friendly.
Well,
Read it one more time, Mr.
Representative Blackburn, back to you. It was just a
I'm just.
amount paid or to be paid for the
Well,
property, including all consideration.
Any other consideration paid to hold the property. I have a hard one with all of that sentence, only because the line before talks about the actual full amount paid, period.
All right, so you can just withdraw your acceptance. We'll go back to your motion, including, it's to delete everything after property down to line 14.
Property.
Yeah, okay. So between the properties and including the last property. So it reads the actual full amount paid or to be paid for the property, comma, terms of sale, and an estimate of the value of the non-real property included in the sale, period, which is all the old language. That's good. Just got a second on that discussion? Anybody out there? Got a second. Anybody out there? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Got a no from Conley. Oh, I didn't mean to point it out. It's just a voice vote, but anyway. Very negative today. Anything else on the bill? So we'll carry it over because it never came in proper form. Not to notice the public in proper form, so we'll carry it over the next meeting. All in favor of carrying it over, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? Okay, great. Any public comment for the rest of the day? And I think the Taxpayer Association, this is it, maybe.
Mr. Chairman, we'll defer till tomorrow.
Are you sure?
Yeah, Chairman Weston has to.
Good, I was getting all geared up for this. All right, is there any other public comment of any nature coming for this meeting? It'd be good if you couldn't be here tomorrow or wanted to talk to us. Yes, sir. Oh, you're just anxious to get out of here. All right, I'm not seeing any public comments, so we're adjourned until what time tomorrow? 8:30? 8:30 in the morning, right here. Thank you to ETS for doing all this today.
Thanks.
You saved my life.